Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval king's bedchamber, not the Hollywood version, with roaring fires and fur-draped luxury, but the actual stone room where frost crept across interior walls, and your breath turned white before you even pulled back the covers. Picture this. You're the most powerful person in the kingdom, you've just spent the day making decisions that affect thousands of lives, and now you're facing the same enemy that terrifies every peasant in your realm, the cold. The kind of cold that doesn't care about your crown, your bloodline, or your supposed connection to God. You probably won't survive this if you make even one mistake in your nightly routine, and here's the twist: you have to do this every single winter night for decades. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing how this little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You push open the heavy wooden door to your bedchamber, and the first thing that hits you isn't warmth. It's the absence of it. The room is maybe 20 feet square with walls 3 feet thick made of stone that's been absorbing the day's meagre heat and radiating cold back at you like a massive refrigerator. There's a fire burning in the hearth, yes, but it's struggling against the vastness of the space, creating a bubble of warmth that extends maybe 6 feet before surrendering completely to the cold. Your servants have been feeding that fire since noon, and still the corners of the room hold shadows that seem darker, because they are actually colder, as if temperature itself has become visible. The floor beneath your feet is flagstone, and even through your leather shoes you can feel it pulling heat from your body. Some kings had rushes strewn across their floors, dried grasses and herbs that provided a thin barrier against the stone and released pleasant scents when crushed. But rushes also held moisture, and moisture meant mould, and mould meant the kind of cough that killed Eleanor of Aquitaine's first child. So you've opted for woven mats in the walkways, expensive things imported from the east, but they only cover the paths between door and bedbed and hearthbed and the corner where your chamber pot waits like a porcelain confession booth. The ceiling arches above you may be 15 feet up, and that's where the heat goes to die. Hot air rises, everyone knows this, but in a medieval chamber, this means your head stays relatively warm while your feet slowly freeze. Historians still argue whether the high ceilings were an intentional design choice for summer cooling or just a structural necessity, but in winter they became your enemy. Some kings had false ceilings installed wooden frameworks draped with fabric that hung lower and trapped heat, but this required trust that the servants maintaining them wouldn't let the fabric touch the torches mounted on the walls. One spark, one moment of carelessness, and you'd wake up not to cold but to fire, which was honestly the only thing worse than freezing. You move toward the hearth and your body instinctively angles toward it, like a plant seeking sun. The fire is burning oak tonight, you can tell by the smell and the quality of the heat. Oak burns slow and steady, nothing like the quick flash of pine or the sooty smoke of green wood. Your master of the chamber knows his job. He's calculated exactly how much wood will last until dawn, accounting for the size of the logs, the dryness of the timber, and the amount of draft coming through the window shutters. Get it wrong, and the fire dies at 3 in the morning, which means you wake up shivering so hard your teeth crack together. Get it very wrong, and you don't wake up at all. There are records of elderly nobles found dead in their beds, after particularly brutal nights, their bodies rigid and their faces peaceful, as if they'd simply decided the cold was too much and surrendered. The light from the hearth casts your shadow enormous against the wall, and you notice the tapestry hanging there rippling slightly. Not from the fire's heat, from the draught coming through the stone itself. Medieval masons did their best, but stone walls aren't airtight, and the wind finds every microscopic gap, every tiny fissure where mortar has crumbled. On really bad nights you can actually feel the breeze inside your chamber, a ghost wind that makes the tapestries dance, and the candle flames bow toward the floor. Your eyes adjust to the firelight, and you take inventory. The bed dominates the room, positioned as far from the window as possible, but close enough to the hearth to benefit from its warmth. There's a small table beside it, holding a cup of wine that your taster checked an hour ago. You'll drink it before sleeping, because alcohol thins the blood and creates the illusion of warmth. Near the bed, a wooden stand holds your chamber robe, thick wool lined with fox fur. In the corner, your armour stands on its rack like a frozen guardian, and you know from experience that if you touched it right now, your skin would stick to the metal. This is your kingdom within the kingdom. This is where the performance of royalty ends and the reality of being human in 1347 takes over. Outside these walls, you're divinely chosen untouchable, the earthly representative of God's will. Inside this chamber, you're just another mammal trying not to freeze to death before morning. The fire pops, sending sparks up the chimney, and you move closer, holding your hands toward the flames. They're already cold, your fingers, even though you've only been in the room for maybe 2 minutes. Welcome to your bedchamber. Welcome to winter. Welcome to the truth about royal life that the ballads never mention. The stone walls surrounding you aren't just cold, they're actively cold, like they have a personal vendetta against human comfort. You reach out and press your palm flat against the interior wall, and within 3 seconds you have to pull away because it's physically painful, like touching ice, but somehow worse, because ice eventually melts. Stone just sits there, eternal and indifferent, absorbing every degree of warmth it can steal from the air, and giving nothing back except a damp chill that seeps into your bones. These walls are 3 feet thick in most places, sometimes 4 where they face the prevailing wind. Your grandfather built this section of the castle, and he built it to withstand siege engines, battering rams, and armies of men with ladders and grappling hooks. Nobody was thinking about comfort. The architectural priorities were clear: strength, first defense, second everything else, a distant third. The result is that you're essentially living inside a gigantic stone battery that charges itself with cold during winter, and holds that cold like a miser hoarding gold. Here's what makes it worse: stone has what modern scientists call high thermal mass. It absorbs temperature slowly and releases it just as slowly, which means in summer your castle stays relatively cool even during hot days, and that's wonderful. But in winter, once those walls get cold in October, they stay cold until April. You could burn 1,000 logs and heat the interior air to something almost comfortable, but the walls remain frozen reservoirs that constantly pull warmth from the space from your body, from your very breath. It's like trying to heat a room while someone's left all the windows open, except the windows are the walls themselves and they can't be closed. Walk around your chamber and you'll notice the temperature stratifies into distinct zones. Right next to the hearth, you're almost comfortable, the radiant heat hits you directly and creates a pocket of civilization. Move 6 feet away and you've lost half that warmth. Get near the exterior walls and you're back in essentially outdoor conditions just without the wind. Historians still argue about whether medieval people were more tolerant of cold or just had no choice but to endure it. But the evidence suggests they suffered just like we would. Medical records from monastery infirmaries list constant cases of chilblains, frostbite on extremities, and respiratory infections that today we'd call pneumonia, but they called winter fever and treated with prayers. The walls sweat. That's not poetic language, they literally sweat. When your servants get the interior temperature up even slightly, moisture in the air condenses on the frigid stone surface, creating a thin film of water that makes everything worse. Damp cold is more dangerous than dry cold because water conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than air does. Touch a sweating wall, and you're not just touching cold stone, you're touching a surface actively wicking warmth from your skin through moisture transfer. Some mornings there's actual frost on the interior walls, delicate patterns that would be beautiful if they weren't a sign that you're basically sleeping outdoors with a roof. Your master mason tried to help. Last year he supervised the installation of wooden panels along the north wall, creating a small air gap between the panelling and the stone. The theory was sound-trapped air acts as insulation, but the execution was problematic. The panels warped from moisture, creating gaps that somehow made the drafts worse. Plus, mice discovered the space between wood and stone and decided it was prime real estate, so now you occasionally hear scratching sounds in the walls at night. You haven't decided yet whether tiny claws skittering behind wooden panels is more or less disturbing than the alternative of silence. The mortar between stones is another weak point. Medieval cement wasn't like modern concrete, it was a mixture of lime sand and whatever the local masons thought might work, and it dried hard but porous. Wind finds these seams like water finding cracks in a dam. On stormy nights you can actually feel distinct jets of cold air shooting through the mortar lines, tiny invisible daggers that find their way across the room to wherever you're standing. Your servants stuff the worst gaps with wadded cloth or even moss, but it's temporary. By midwinter the stuffing has dried and shrunk and the wind is back. The truly wealthy, the Duke of Burgundy for instance, sometimes had double walls constructed, with a hollow space between them, and that actually worked reasonably well. But double walls mean twice the construction cost, twice the time, and a fortress that's substantially thicker and harder to defend. Your father chose strength over comfort, and now you're living with that decision every night. Would you trade 6 inches of defensive wall thickness for better insulation? Ask yourself that at noon when you're strategizing about potential invasions, and the answer is no. Ask yourself that at 3 in the morning when you're shivering under 6 blankets, and the answer might be different. The stones themselves tell stories if you look closely. Some have chisel marks from the quarry, some have mason's marks, little symbols carved by the workers who shaped them a kind of medieval signature. There's one stone near the door with what looks like a face carved into it, probably a bored apprentice's joke decades ago. You've stared at that face during countless sleepless nights, and sometimes it seems sympathetic, like it understands what you're going through. Other times it looks mocking, like it's thinking, "I'm stone, I don't feel temperature, and you're just soft meat that's slowly freezing." The exterior walls are worse than interior ones, obviously. They face the winter wind directly getting sandblasted by sleet and snow, and they transmit that cold inward like they're being paid to do it. You've noticed that your bed's headboard, which your servants positioned against an interior wall, for exactly this reason is noticeably warmer than the side of the bed facing the outer wall. Even through all the fabric and furs and hangings, you can feel the difference. Some nights you sleep angled diagonally just to keep your feet away from the cold zone. Stone was supposed to be permanent eternal, a symbol of your dynasty's enduring power, and it'll outlast you by centuries. But right now, in the middle of February, you trade all that symbolic permanence for a little actual warmth. The fire crackles behind you, and you turn away from the wall, flexing your fingers to get feeling back into them. You've been king for 12 years, and you still haven't gotten used to these walls. The hearth in your chamber isn't just a fireplace, it's a relationship, a demanding partner, that requires constant attention, resources, and respect, because the moment you neglect it, people die. Not metaphorically, actually die. You've inherited this hearth from your father, who inherited it from his father, and it's been burning in some form or another for 70 years, a flame that's technically never been allowed to go completely cold, because relighting it from scratch, with flint and steel in the middle of winter, is both difficult and symbolically bad. A dead hearth in a king's chamber suggests weakness, vulnerability, the kind of thing that gets whispered about in corridors and noted by visiting ambassadors. The fireplace itself is massive, maybe 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep, with an opening tall enough that you could stand inside it if you wanted to inspect the chimney. You don't want to do that, because even with a fire burning, the upper reaches of that chimney are freezing cold, and the draft it creates is both necessary and torturous. The chimney pulls smoke up and out, yes, but it also pulls warm air from the room, creating a constant flow that means you're essentially heating the sky. Medieval architects understood this problem, but couldn't solve it. You need the draft for the smoke to escape, but the draft also makes the fire less efficient. It's an engineering compromise that you pay for in cords of wood. Speaking of wood, you go through an absolutely staggering amount of it. Your master of the chamber calculates that this single fireplace burning from sunset to sunrise during winter months consumes roughly half a cord of wood per night. That's 4 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet of stacked timber every single night. Multiply that by however many chambers in the castle need heating, add the Great Hall's enormous fireplace, the kitchens, and you start to understand why medieval kingdoms had strict forest management laws. You're not just ruling people, you're managing an ecosystem that has to produce enough burnable wood to keep the nobility from freezing, while still leaving timber for construction, shipbuilding, and charcoal production. The wood arrives in your chamber in carefully selected stages. Your servants start the evening fire with kindling small dry twigs and wood shavings that catch quickly from a coal carried up from the kitchen fires. Then finger-thick branches, then wrist-thick logs, building up the heat gradually until the fireplace can accept the real fuel. Oak logs as thick as your thigh, sometimes 4 feet long, that'll burn for hours if they're properly seasoned. Seasoned means dried for at least a year, preferably 2, because green wood, freshly cut timber produces more smoke than heat, and fills your chamber with a choking haze that makes your eyes stream and your throat burn. Your forest wardens know which trees to mark for the castle. Oak is king for overnight fires, dense, slow burning, producing steady heat and good coals. Ash is second choice, burning hot and clean. Beech works well. You avoid pine except for kindling because resinous woods spark and pop, sending tiny embers flying out onto the floor, rushes, and every winter there are stories about castles or manor houses burning down because a pine knot exploded and nobody noticed until the tapestries were ablaze. Your grandfather lost a cousin that way. She was elderly, sleeping close to a fire, and a spark landed on her wool blanket. By the time servants broke down the door, there wasn't much left to save. The fire itself has moods, personalities. Some nights it burns cheerful and cooperative, the log settling into place with gentle sighs, the flames dancing in predictable patterns. Other nights it's sullen, smoking for no reason, refusing to draw properly, creating pockets of cold ash that won't ignite no matter how much you poke them. Your servants claim they can predict the weather by how the fire burns. A smoking fire means rain coming, they say. A fire that roars up the chimney too eagerly means wind. A fire that burns blue at the base means intense cold approaching. You're not sure if this is actual wisdom or just medieval superstition, but you've noticed they're right, more often than they're wrong. Tending the fire is someone's entire job. Usually it's a young male servant, maybe 14 or 15, whose sole responsibility from dusk until dawn is to keep your chamber fire alive. He sits on a stool near the hearth, but not too near because even servants can get burns and watches. Every hour or so he adds a log, positioning it carefully to ensure good airflow. He uses a long iron poker to adjust the burning wood, breaking up ash that might smother the coals, pushing logs closer together when the fire needs concentration, or spreading them apart when it's burning too hot. It's skilled work despite looking simple. A bad fire tender can waste wood, fill your room with smoke, or let the fire die at 3 in the morning, which is how you get fired. Literally dismissed from service, sent back to whatever village produced you. The heat the fireplace produces is radiant, which means it travels in straight lines from the flames to whatever they're pointed at. Stand facing the fire, and your front gets roasted while your back stays cold. Turn around to warm your back, and your front immediately starts losing the heat it just gained. This is why people in medieval illustrations are always clustered around hearths in semicircles. They're rotating like rotisserie chickens, trying to distribute the warmth evenly. You've done this yourself countless times, standing in your nightshirt, turning slowly, trying to get warm enough that you can make the dash to your bed without your teeth chattering. The fireplace also produces smoke, always, no matter how good your wood or how well designed your chimney. Some of it escapes up the flue, but some of it curls back into the room, especially when the wind outside changes direction and creates weird pressure situations. You've woken up at dawn with your throat raw and your eyes itching. The chamber hazy with a thin layer of smoke that's been accumulating all night. It's not enough to suffocate you, but it's enough to make you cough. And that chronic low-level smoke exposure is probably why so many nobles develop what medieval physicians called winter lung, persistent coughs that start in November and don't fully clear until spring. The unspoken contract is simple. You feed the hearth keeps you alive. Miss a night, get careless with the wood supply and the cold winds. You glance at the fire, now watching your servant add another log, the bark catching immediately, flames licking up around the new fuel. For the next 8 hours, that boy's vigilance is the only thing standing between you and hypothermia. You've rewarded good fire tenders with silver coins at winter's end. You've dismissed bad ones before they could kill you through incompetence. The hearth doesn't care about your crown. It only cares about wood air and constant attention. Look at the walls around you, and what you're actually seeing isn't stone, it's fabric. Layers and layers of heavy tapestries hanging from iron rods covering almost every available surface, except the space immediately around the hearth where fire is a concern. These aren't decorations, though. They're certainly decorative. These are technology, medieval insulation, the difference between merely cold and actually deadly. A bare stone wall radiates cold like a malevolent presence. A tapestry-covered wall traps a layer of air between fabric and stone, and that dead air space, even just an inch or two, dramatically reduces the heat loss. It's not exactly warm, but it's survivable, which in February is honestly the best you can hope for. The tapestry directly across from your bed depicts a hunting scene. Nobles on horseback chasing a stag through a forest, dogs running, birds flying overhead. You've stared at this image for so many nights that you know every thread, every face, every tree. The weaving is Flemish, created by artisans in Arras who spent 2 years working on it, and it cost more than a good warhorse. But it's worth every coin because this single piece of fabric, measuring maybe 12 feet wide and 8 feet tall, covers a section of north-facing wall that would otherwise be radiating cold directly at your bed. The weavers used wool mostly with some linen threads for highlights, and the thickness is substantial, maybe half an inch of dense fabric that has weight and presence. You can actually feel the difference when you walk past a tapestry versus an uncovered section of wall. The bare stone pulls heat from the air aggressively, creating a noticeable cold zone that extends maybe 2 feet out. The tapestried wall feels neutral, almost passive, like it's given up trying to freeze you and settled into reluctant coexistence. Some nights when you can't sleep, you've stood with your back against a tapestry, feeling the slight give of the fabric, the way it holds your body heat for a few moments before releasing it. It's oddly comforting, like being held by something that doesn't judge or demand. The air gap behind the tapestries becomes its own ecosystem. Spiders love it back there, you've seen them, occasionally emerging from behind the fabric, fat medieval spiders that have been living rent-free in the space between art and architecture. Mice sometimes nest there too, chewing tiny holes in the bottom edges where the tapestry touches the floor. Your chamberlain has the servants check regularly, pulling the bottom edge away from the wall and looking for signs of infestation, because the last thing you need is rodents using your expensive insulation as a highway system. One castle you heard this from a visiting baron had rats chew through a tapestry depicting the crucifixion eating right through Christ's face. The baron claimed it was a demonic sign. His bishop claimed it was poor housekeeping. Both were probably right. The tapestries move. At first glance they seem static, but watch them for a while and you'll notice constant subtle motion. The draft from the window shutters makes them ripple like water. The heat rising from the hearth creates convection currents that cause the fabric to billow slightly, like the wall is breathing. Sometimes at night, lit only by firelight, the hunting scene seems to come alive. The horses actually galloping the dogs, actually running shadows playing across the woven threads in ways that create the illusion of movement. It's beautiful and slightly unsettling, like your walls are having dreams. Not every wall can be covered. The section around the hearth has to stay clear for obvious fire safety reasons, and that's where you feel the cold. Most intensely, the functional necessity creates a thermal weak point. The wall with the window is partially bare because you need access to open and close the shutters, though your servants have rigged a smaller tapestry on a movable frame that can be positioned to block the window at night. The door wall has a tapestry with a slit cut in it, so the fabric hangs on either side of the door frame, which mostly works but creates annoying gaps where cold air sneaks through. Some nobles go further. The Duke of Berry, you've heard stories about his chambers, supposedly has tapestries hung not just on walls but from the ceiling as well, creating a fabric room within the stone room. It sounds excessive until you spend a night in a castle in January, and then it sounds like genius. Historians still argue whether this practice was common or just a peculiarity of particularly cold-sensitive nobles. But the account books don't lie. Wealthy households in Northern Europe spent enormous sums on tapestries, and they weren't buying them purely for aesthetic reasons. The images woven into the tapestries serve a psychological purpose too. You're surrounded by scenes of summer gardens, hunts, courtly love scenes under trees in full leaf. It's fantasy, yes, but it's deliberate fantasy. A reminder that winter doesn't last forever, that the world outside these stone walls contains warmth and life and colour. Medieval people understood seasonal depression even if they didn't have that term for it. They called it winter melancholy and treated it with fire community and visual reminders of better times. Your hunting tapestry isn't just insulation, it's medicine for the mind. The economics of tapestries are brutal. A large piece takes years to create, requires skilled artisans, expensive dyes, and massive quantities of wool. Only the wealthy can afford them, which means the poor are stuck with bare stone walls, or if they're lucky, cheaper wool blankets hung on nails. The thermal performance of a blanket is decent, but nowhere near as good as a proper tapestry, and blankets wear out faster, fade faster, and accumulate smoke and moisture until they become more liability than asset. The gap between noble and peasant isn't just about political power. It's measured in degrees Fahrenheit in layers of fabric between skin and stone. You reach out and touch the hunting tapestry, your fingers tracing the woven outline of a horse's mane. The fabric is slightly damp from condensation and cold, but not stone cold. It's done its job tonight, this expensive piece of art/technology. The wall behind it is probably rimmed with frost, but you can't feel it, can't see it, and that ignorance is its own kind of warmth. The fire crackles, the tapestry ripples, the stone walls hide behind fabric, and for a moment you can almost forget they're there. Now look at the bed itself, the centerpiece, the fortress, the architectural achievement that your great-grandfather's carpenter spent 6 months building, and that subsequent generations have modified into something approaching a survival pod. This isn't furniture. This is a structure, a room within a room, a carefully engineered microclimate designed to trap your body heat and protect you from the ambient cold that wants to kill you. From the outside, it looks almost like a small house complete with 4 carved posts that rise 8 feet from the floor, supporting a wooden canopy frame that's draped with enough fabric to outfit a merchant ship. The bed sits on a raised platform maybe 18 inches off the floor, and that elevation matters more than you'd think. Cold air is heavy at sinks and pools at ground level like invisible water, so getting yourself up off the floor means escaping the coldest layer of the room. Your servants sleep on the floor, sometimes rolled in blankets, and they wake up colder than you do, despite being closer to the hearth, because they're down in the thermal basement where the worst cold settles. The platform also provides storage underneath wooden chests containing extra bedding, winter clothes, and emergency supplies. It's practical, yes, but also symbolic. The king sleeps above separate elevated, even in unconsciousness. The 4 posts are oak carved with your family's heraldry, lions, crosses, vines twisting upward. Each post is maybe 6 inches thick, solid enough to support the canopy frame and all the fabric hanging from it. That fabric is the bed's real defense system. Heavy wool curtains hang from the canopy frame on all 4 sides, and when you draw them closed, you create an enclosed space, maybe 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet tall. It's like sleeping in a very luxurious tent, except the tent is inside a stone building, and the stakes are your life rather than your comfort. The curtains themselves are lined 2 layers of fabric with a thin batting of wool between them, and they're heavy enough that pulling them across the opening requires actual effort. You've got to system enter the bed, arrange yourself, then reach out and draw the curtains closed one by one, sealing yourself in. The final curtain, the one on the side nearest the hearth, you leave slightly open for the first hour, letting heat from the fire enter your enclosed space and warm the air. Once you feel drowsy, you close it completely, and then you're in your own private atmosphere, breathing recycled air that rapidly warms from your body heat. Inside the curtained space, the temperature can be 20 or even 30 degrees warmer than the chamber outside. Your breath, your body heat, everything gets trapped and accumulates. It's stuffy, yes, and sometimes the air gets stale enough that you wake up with a dull headache, but stuffy is warm, and warm means alive. Some mornings when you open the curtains, you can actually see the temperature difference. Your breath immediately becomes visible, as the warm air from inside the bed meets the cold chamber air, creating clouds of condensation that drift upward toward the ceiling. The canopy overhead serves multiple purposes. Obviously it supports the curtains, but it also stops heat from rising and escaping. Remember that warm air rises without the canopy, your body heat would just float up to the high ceiling and disappear. The canopy traps, it keeps it hovering at sleeping level, where it actually does you some good. The fabric is usually a lighter material than the curtain, sometimes linen, sometimes thin wool, and it's often decorated. Yours has embroidered stars, a night sky that's warmer and safer than the real one outside. The curtains also block light, which matters more than you'd expect. The fire creates dancing shadows all night, and even through closed eyelids that constant flicker can disrupt sleep. Draw the bed curtains, and you're in darkness. Real darkness. The kind that lets your mind finally disconnect from the day. Medieval people understood that sleep required not just warmth, but also sensory deprivation. The fewer stimuli, the deeper the rest. Your bed is a sensory isolation chamber that happens to also be a thermal refuge. There's a psychological component too. Closing the curtains creates safety, privacy, a boundary between your vulnerable sleeping self and everything beyond. Historians still argue about whether bed curtains were primarily for warmth or for privacy in crowded households, but in your case it's both. Even though you sleep alone most nights, queens often had separate chambers, partly for propriety, and partly because royal marriage was political rather than romantic. The curtains make you feel protected. Protected from cold, yes, but also from poisoners, from assassins, from the weight of the crown that sits too heavily even when you're not wearing it. The curtain fabric accumulates smoke over time, absorbing the smell of the hearth, until the wool itself seems to emit a faint wood smoke scent. You've grown to find this comforting rather than unpleasant. It's the smell of warmth, of survival, of nights successfully endured. Your servants take down the curtains twice a year for cleaning, beating them outside until clouds of dust and soot emerge, then hanging them in the sun to air. You hate those days because the bed looks naked and vulnerable, without its fabric armour, just a wooden frame that makes promises it can't keep. Some beds have additional features. You've heard of nobles who had their beds constructed with small doors that could be latched from inside, turning the sleeping space into an actual lockable room. Others had warming pans built into the frame metal boxes, where coals could be placed radiating heat upward through ventilated channels. Your bed is simpler, more traditional, relying on fabric and physics rather than elaborate mechanisms. Simple is reliable, simple doesn't break in the middle of January. You approach the bed now, and just seeing it triggers a Pavlovian response. Your body knows what comes next, knows that beyond those curtains is the warmest you'll be for the next 8 hours. The posts rise like pillars of a temple, the curtains hang like walls of a sanctuary. This bed has cradled 3 generations of your family through countless winters. It'll cradle you tonight, and if you're lucky and the servants do their jobs, and the fire doesn't die, and the cold doesn't find some new way through your defences, it'll cradle you tomorrow night too. You reach out and touch one of the posts, feeling the smooth wood that hundreds of hands have touched before yours, all of them seeking the same thing, a few hours of warmth in a world designed to freeze them. Now, let's talk about what's actually on that bed, because this is where medieval survival gets truly impressive, or desperate depending on your perspective. You're not just throwing a blanket over a mattress and calling it good. You're constructing a thermal layer cake, each component serving a specific purpose, the whole system designed to trap heat-wick moisture and keep you alive until dawn. Start from the bottom and work your way up, and you'll understand why your bed weighs approximately as much as a small horse. The base is a wooden frame with rope webbing stretched across it, creating a slightly springy surface. Medieval beds didn't have box springs or metal coils, just rope woven in a crosshatch pattern, tightened periodically when it started to sag. Sleep tight isn't just a saying, it's literal advice about maintaining your rope tension. On top of the ropes goes the first mattress, and calling it a mattress is generous. It's a large cloth sack stuffed with straw, maybe 6 inches thick, when new, compressing down to 3 or 4 inches after a few months of use. Straw is cheap, replaceable, and provides some cushioning, but it also rustles every time you move, sounds like you're sleeping in a barn, and occasionally harbours insects that are very interested in your blood. On top of the straw mattress goes the feather mattress, and this is where real money starts to show up. Yours is stuffed with goose down the soft underlayer feathers that geese grow for insulation, and it took probably 30 geese to produce enough down for this one mattress. It's maybe 8 inches thick, enclosed in tightly woven linen to prevent the feathers from escaping, and it provides genuine comfort, soft enough to cradle your body, thick enough to insulate you from the straw below. Poor nobles make do with chicken feathers, which are coarser and less insulating. Peasants get straw all the way down and consider themselves lucky if the straw is fresh. The feather mattress does something clever. It traps air between thousands of tiny feather filaments, and that trapped air creates insulation. It's the same principle as the tapestries on your walls, but more refined, more effective. Your body heat warms the air trapped in the down, and that warmth radiates back to you rather than escaping into the room. On a good night, the feather mattress warms up in the first hour and stays warm until morning. On a bad night, when it's truly cold, the mattress can't generate enough warmth and just becomes a slightly softer version of sleeping on frozen ground. Now the furs start. First layer sheepskin wool side up, covering the entire sleeping surface. Wool is magical stuff. It insulates even when damp wicks moisture away from your skin and provides texture that's somehow both scratchy and comforting. Your sheepskin is from local animals, nothing exotic, but it's thick and well cured. Some nobles prefer goat skin because it's slightly warmer, but goats smell even after tanning, and you've decided sheep is the better compromise between warmth and olfactory dignity. On top of the sheepskin, the blankets. You've got 6 of them in rotation, though you don't use all 6 every night. 2 wool blankets, heavy and slightly coarse, dyed blue with woad, because undyed wool shows stains and you're human, you sweat, sometimes you're ill. These blankets are massive, maybe 8 feet square, because they need to tuck in on all sides and still cover you completely when you curl into a sleeping position. Medieval people didn't sleep stretched out like modern folks. They slept curled knees, drawn up often in what's called the fetal position today, but what medieval people just called staying warm. Then 2 more blankets of finer wool, lighter weight, but tighter, weave functioning more like insulation layers than heavy covering. These trap air between themselves and the heavier blankets below, creating another dead air space, another thermal barrier. The weave is tight enough that wind can't penetrate, and yes, you can feel wind inside your bed on the worst night's draft, sneaking through gaps in the curtains and trying to rob you of warmth. On top of those fur blankets, real fur with the hair still attached, usually fox or rabbit because they're common, though you've got one made from bear that your father took on a hunting trip 20 years ago. The bear fur is almost comically heavy, maybe 20 pounds. and you only use it on the absolute coldest nights, because sleeping under it feels like being pinned by a large dead animal, which technically you are. But it's warm, astonishingly warm, the kind of warmth that makes you understand why bears themselves don't freeze during hibernation. The final layer, the top blanket, is lined with ermine white fur with black tail tips, the traditional symbol of royalty. Ermine isn't particularly warm compared to other furs, but it's expensive and beautiful and everyone knows it, so having an ermine coverlet announces your status even when you're unconscious. Medieval fashion rules are weird. You're allowed to freeze to death as long as you look appropriately regal while doing it. The ermine blanket is more about morning audiences than midnight warmth. When servants enter to wake you, they see the ermine first, a visual reminder of hierarchy before you've even opened your eyes. Altogether, these layers add up to maybe 40 or 50 pounds of fabric and fur pressing down on you. Modern people might call this claustrophobic, but medieval people understood that weight equals warmth. The pressure helps trap heat, prevents the layers from shifting during sleep, and provides deep pressure stimulation that's actually calming. You've tried sleeping with fewer blankets on warmer nights, and you always sleep worse, not because you're cold, but because you're not used to the lightness, the freedom. Your body has been trained to associate weight with safety. The blankets extend beyond the mattress edges, hanging down on all sides, creating yet another barrier against drafts rising from the floor. Nothing is left to chance. Every gap is covered, every thermal leak is sealed. When you burrow into this bed, pulling the furs up to your chin, drawing the curtains closed around you, you're entering a survival system that's been refined over generations. It's not perfect, you'll still wake up cold. Sometimes still feel drafts finding their way through, but it's enough. On most nights, it's enough. You run your hand over the top blanket, feeling the ermine's softness, and begin the process of arranging yourself for sleep. The weight of the furs settles over you like an embrace that doesn't judge, doesn't demand, just holds. Before you even think about getting into that bed, there's a ritual that has to happen. A ceremony of heat transfer that's so important, your servants know to begin it without being asked. The warming pan ceremony. Picture this, a long wooden handle, maybe 4 feet of smooth ash or oak, attached to a large brass pan with a hinged lid, and inside that pan glowing coals from the hearth, carefully selected for their heat output and lack of sparks. Your servant, usually the same young man who tends the fire, lifts this contraption and begins the slow, methodical process of preheating your bed. He starts at the foot of the bed, sliding the warming pan between the sheets, moving it in slow circles. You can hear the faint scraping sound as brass touches linen, can see the slight bulge in the blankets as the pan moves underneath like some kind of burrowing creature. The goal is to transfer heat from the coals into the fabric, warming the sheets and the layers of furs and blankets above them, creating a pocket of warmth that'll last just long enough for your body heat to take over. It's a race against thermodynamics. The bed is cold. Your body heat alone won't warm it fast enough, so you cheat by preloading thermal energy. The servant works methodically, spending maybe 2 minutes on each section of the bed. Foot area first, because cold feet make sleep impossible. Medieval people understood this intuitively, even without modern science about thermoregulation and blood flow. Then the middle section, where your torso will lie then up toward the pillows. He's careful not to linger too long in any one spot because brass conducts heat efficiently, and too much concentration can actually scorch the linen sheets. You've seen sheets with brown burn marks from careless or distracted servants, and while the damage is purely aesthetic, it's embarrassing. A king's sheets should be pristine, or at least as pristine as centuries-old linen technology allows. The warming pan itself is an heirloom passed down from your grandmother. The brass is dented and tarnished despite regular polishing, and the lid is slightly warped from decades of thermal expansion and contraction, but it works. Some warming pans are elaborate affairs with perforated lids in decorative patterns, crosses, fleur-de-lis, family crests that let small amounts of smoke escape while keeping the coals contained. Yours is simpler, more utilitarian, with just a few small holes for ventilation. The simplicity makes it reliable. Reliable matters when the alternative is climbing into a bed that feels like a snowbank. The whole process takes maybe 10 minutes, and you can actually see the servant starting to sweat from the exertion. Holding that long handle steady while moving the heavy brass pan requires real arm strength, especially when you're doing it carefully enough not to damage anything. Historians still argue about whether warming pans were common or a luxury, but household accounts from noble estates list them regularly, and there are enough surviving examples in museums that it's clear they were standard equipment for anyone who could afford brass and servants. Here's the catch: the warmth doesn't last. Maybe 2 hours, 3 if you're lucky, and the coals were really hot and your servant was thorough. After that, the bed returns to ambient temperature, which in your chamber is only slightly warmer than outside. So the warming pan doesn't solve the cold problem, it just delays it, gives you a running start, lets you fall asleep in something approaching comfort, so that by the time the cold comes back, you're already unconscious, and your body has heated the immediate space around you. It's a window of opportunity, nothing more. And if you waste it, if you take too long with your evening prayers, or your final wine, or your nervous pacing about tomorrow's council meeting, you've missed the window, and now you're climbing into a cold bed anyway. The coals in the pan are usually oak or beech, selected for their ability to hold heat without producing much smoke or smell. You don't want your sheets reeking of wood smoke, though. Honestly, they smell like wood smoke anyway, because everything in this castle smells like wood smoke. It's the default scent of medieval indoor life, so pervasive that you only notice it when you travel and spend a night somewhere with different wood pine in the Northern Territories, olive wood in the south, and suddenly your nose remembers that smoke can have varieties, nuances, personalities. Some nobles have experimented with alternatives. Heated stones wrapped in cloth, for instance, which hold heat longer than coals, but are harder to move around and occasionally crack explosively when they get too hot. Or hot water bottles made from leather or pig bladder, which work well until they leak, and then you've got wet cold sheets that are actually worse than unwarmed sheets. Or, and you've heard this is popular in the Low Countries, hot bricks buried in sandboxes at the foot of the bed, radiating steady heat upward for hours. But bricks are heavy and require custom-built bed frames, and you've got enough logistical challenges without redesigning your furniture. Your servant finishes the warming pan routine and withdraws the pan from the bed, bowing slightly as he backs away. The sheets are warm now, genuinely warm, and you have maybe 20 minutes before that warmth begins its inevitable dissipation into the cold. It's time. You've delayed as long as you can, said your prayers, checked the door bolts, confirmed the fire tender knows his duties, inspected the chamber pot, drunk your wine. There's nothing left to do but commit. The bed is ready. The warming pan has done its job. Now it's your turn to survive until dawn. You climb onto the platform, pull back the curtains, and feel the wave of warmth that escapes from the preheated bed space. For just this moment, for maybe 15 seconds, you're warm, in a way that feels almost impossible, almost miraculous. The sheets are soft and hot against your skin, the furs settle over you with their familiar weight, and you think maybe tonight won't be so bad. Maybe tonight you'll sleep through until morning without waking. The warming pan ceremony, this nightly ritual of transferred heat, has brought you hope. That's worth more than the brass it's made from. Now here's something that'll sound strange to modern ears, but was completely normal to you. You're not planning to sleep through the night. Nobody does. The idea of 8 consecutive hours of unconsciousness is a modern invention, a byproduct of artificial lighting and industrial work schedules. In your world, in 1347, sleep comes in 2 distinct segments, separated by an hour or more of wakefulness. And this isn't insomnia. This is just how human beings sleep when they're not fighting against their biology, with alarm clocks and caffeine. You'll have your first sleep starting maybe an hour after sunset, around 8 or 9 in the evening, depending on the season. This first segment lasts roughly 4 hours deep, and restorative your body temperature, dropping your mind, processing the day's events, through dreams you'll half remember. Then, around midnight or 1 in the morning, you'll wake up. Not because something's wrong, not because you're cold or need to urinate, though both of those might also be true, but because this is what humans do. This midnight waking is so universal that it has names in multiple languages. First waking in English, dorveil. In French, the space between sleeps that's neither quite wakefulness nor quite sleep. What do you do during this hour? Lots of things, actually. Pray, obviously, medieval Christianity structured itself around these natural rhythms, and there are specific prayers for the middle-of-the-night acknowledgements of vulnerability and gratitude for surviving half the darkness. Some people light a candle, though you usually don't, because getting up means exposing yourself to the chamber's cold, and you'd rather stay buried in your furs. You might talk if your wife is sharing your bed, which she does occasionally despite having her own chamber. Historians have found references to midnight conversations between spouses, discussions about household matters, children worries that feel more manageable in the darkness somehow. Sometimes you eat a small amount, there's usually bread and cheese on the bedside table covered with cloth to keep it relatively fresh. Medieval medical theory held that an empty stomach at night led to bad humours and disturbed sleep, so a midnight snack wasn't indulgence, it was preventive medicine. The bread is hard by now, hours old, but you gnaw on it slowly, letting your body ease from sleep into this twilight consciousness and back again. Often you just lie there thinking. Not anxiously, medieval people didn't have the same relationship with productivity and time that creates modern insomnia. You're not worried about wasting time because time in the middle of the night doesn't count the same way daytime hours do. This is liminal time outside normal schedules, almost sacred in its uselessness. You might think about the dream you just had, trying to decode its meaning because medieval people believed dreams contained messages from God or warnings about the future. You might plan tomorrow's activities, though not obsessively. Mostly you just exist breathing quietly in the darkness of your curtained bed, aware of the fire crackling somewhere beyond the fabric walls. This segmented sleep pattern affects everything about medieval life. Servants know that the household wakes in the middle of the night, so there's often someone moving around tending fires, checking security. Criminals know this too, which is why the darkest, most dangerous time isn't midnight. It's the dead zone between first sleep and second sleep, when most people are genuinely unconscious. Monks structure their entire days around these sleep segments, with services at Vespers before first sleep matins during the middle waking and lauds after second sleep. The rhythm of prayer matches the rhythm of human biology. Some scholars, the few who can read and afford candles, do their best thinking during this midnight waking. Roger Bacon supposedly made many of his scientific observations during these hours, finding that his mind was clearer, less distracted than during daylight. There's something about the stillness, the darkness, the absence of social demands that makes this a productive time for certain kinds of thought. You've solved political problems during these midnight wakings, seeing solutions that eluded you in daylight, when advisors were talking and petitioners were demanding, and the whole weight of the kingdom pressed down on your shoulders. The waking period usually lasts about an hour, sometimes 90 minutes. You feel it when sleep is ready to return, a heaviness in your limbs, a slowing of thoughts, the way your eyes want to close even though you're not particularly tired. This is when you say a final prayer, adjust your position in bed, maybe pull the furs a bit tighter, and let yourself drift into second sleep. This second segment is often lighter than the first, more prone to dreams, and you'll wake from it more naturally as dawn approaches. It's a gentler sleep, less deep, your body already beginning the transition toward wakefulness, even while you're still unconscious. Historians still argue about when this segmented sleep pattern disappeared. Some say it started fading with widespread artificial lighting in the 17th century. Others claim it persisted in rural areas until the 20th century. But in your time in medieval Europe, this is universal. Ask any peasant, any merchant, any bishop, and they'll confirm sleep comes in two parts with waking in between. The idea of sleeping through the night without waking would seem bizarre, unnatural, maybe even unhealthy. So when you settle into bed tonight, you're not setting yourself up for 8 hours of continuous unconsciousness. You're preparing for first sleep, knowing that around midnight you'll surface back into consciousness, spend an hour in that strange twilight state, then descend again into second sleep until dawn. It's a rhythm as old as humanity, a pattern that industrial society will eventually break, but that you and everyone you know still follow. The warming pan's heat is already beginning to fade. Your body is relaxing into the furs. The first sleep is coming. You'll wake in a few hours, but that's fine. That's expected. That's just how sleep works, and it'll work the same way tomorrow night and the night after until spring finally arrives, and the desperate fight against cold can pause for a few merciful months. What you're wearing to bed tonight is another carefully calculated decision in the ongoing war against cold. You're not sleeping naked, that would be suicidal, like volunteering for hypothermia. You're not sleeping in your daytime clothes either, because those are designed for movement and display, not for trapping body heat in a stationary position for hours. You're wearing a nightshirt, a specific garment designed for this specific purpose, and even this simple piece of clothing represents layers of medieval thinking about survival modesty and the boundary between wakefulness and sleep. The nightshirt is linen, not wool, which seems counterintuitive until you understand the logic. Linen absorbs moisture, specifically the sweat your body produces even in cold weather. You might not feel yourself sweating under 6 layers of furs, but you are constantly, because that's how human thermoregulation works. Wool next to skin traps that moisture and becomes damp, and damp fabric conducts heat away from your body 25 times faster than dry fabric. Linen wicks the moisture away from your skin, keeping you relatively dry, which keeps you warmer in the long run. It's counterintuitive but effective, the kind of knowledge that took generations to figure out through trial and literally fatal error. Your nightshirt is long, reaching down to your ankles with long sleeves that cover your arms completely. There's a small slit at the neck closed with a single button or tie, and that's the only opening besides the hem. The goal is to cover every inch of skin that doesn't absolutely need to be exposed. Medieval people understood that exposed skin loses heat rapidly, and while you can't do anything about your face and hands, you can at least protect your torso, arms and legs. Some nightshirts have small attached hoods or caps, though yours doesn't. You wear a separate wool cap instead pulled down over your ears because your head is where significant heat loss occurs. The nightshirt is loose, not fitted, which serves multiple purposes. Tight clothing restricts blood flow to extremities, and restricted blood flow means colder fingers and toes. Loose fabric creates air pockets between the fabric and your skin, and those air pockets provide insulation, the same principle as the tapestries on your walls and the feathers in your mattress. Everything medieval people know about staying warm comes back to the same idea. Trap air, prevent convection, maintain dead space where heat can accumulate. The fabric is well-worn soft from countless washings, and it smells faintly of the lavender that your laundry servants store with the linens to keep moths away and provide a pleasant scent. New linen is stiff and scratchy, but this nightshirt has been yours for 3 years, and the fibres have softened into something genuinely comfortable. You've got newer nightshirts, gifts from your wife, or purchased from merchants, but you keep coming back to this one because familiar clothing matters when you're vulnerable. Sleep is when you're most defenseless, and having something familiar, something that's touched your skin hundreds of times before, provides psychological comfort that's hard to quantify but impossible to dismiss. Under the nightshirt you're wearing braize, basically medieval underwear linen shorts that tie at the waist. These serve the obvious hygienic purpose, but they also provide an additional layer of insulation over your groin and upper thighs. Some men sleep without them, but you've found that the extra layer helps, particularly on the coldest nights when every degree matters. The braize are loose, comfortable, designed for sleeping, rather than for the fitted support that daytime braize provide. On your feet, wool stockings, thick ones, the kind that would be too warm for daytime wear but are barely adequate for sleeping. Your feet are the hardest part of your body to keep warm, because they're farthest from your heart, receive less blood flow and tend to stick out from under the blankets during sleep. Cold feet wake you up, prevent you from falling asleep, and contribute to that bone-deep chill that no amount of blankets seems to fix. The stockings are knitted probably by one of the castle's older women who have lost the finger dexterity for finer work but can still manage basic knitting. They're not beautiful, but they're functional, and function is what matters after sunset. On your head, the wool cap, as mentioned, pulled down to cover your ears and most of your forehead. Medieval people understood that you lose significant heat through your head. Modern science confirms you lose maybe 10% of your body heat through your skull, and a covered head makes a noticeable difference in overall warmth. The cap is red, dyed with madder root, though the colour doesn't matter since nobody sees it except your servants. It ties under your chin with a simple cord snug enough to stay on during sleep but not tight enough to be uncomfortable. This outfit nightshirt, braize stockings. Cap would look absurd to someone from the 21st century, like a cartoon of medieval sleepwear. But you're not dressing for aesthetics. You're dressing for survival, and every piece of this outfit serves a purpose. Historians still debate whether common people wore similar garments or simply slept in their daytime clothes, but account books from noble households regularly list purchases of linen for nightshirts, wool for sleeping caps, suggesting these were standard items for anyone who could afford them. There's also a robe, a heavy wool chamber robe lined with fur hanging on a stand near your bed. You don't wear this to sleep, it's too bulky, too restrictive, but you wear it when you wake during the night and need to move around the chamber. Maybe you need the chamber pot, or you want to check the fire, or you're experiencing that midnight waking we talked about earlier and feel compelled to pray at your small private altar. The robe is essentially a wearable blanket, and putting it on is like carrying a piece of your bed's warmth with you as you venture into the hostile cold of the chamber. Some kings go further. You've heard stories about monarchs who sleep in full daytime clothes, including outer robes, because they're paranoid about assassination attempts and want to be ready to fight or flee at any moment. Others wear elaborate silk nightshirts embroidered with religious symbols or family crests, because even in sleep they can't let go of status performance. You've chosen the middle path, practical warmth, combined with minimal dignity. You're covered, you're insulated, and if someone bursts into your chamber in the middle of the night, you're not naked, but you're also not pretending to be fully ready for a court audience. You adjust your nightshirt one final time, making sure the hem is pulled down properly, checking that the stockings haven't bunched up around your ankles. These small adjustments matter because once you're under the furs, once you've achieved a comfortable position, you don't want to move. Every movement lets cold air into the warm cocoon you're building, resets the thermal clock, forces you to start the warming process over. Get comfortable now, or suffer later. That's the rule. The nightshirt settles against your skin, soft and familiar, and you're ready for the next step, actually getting into bed and beginning the careful process of arranging yourself for sleep. Now, let's address something that might seem strange or even scandalous to modern sensibilities, but was completely practical and unremarkable in your world body heat sharing. On the coldest nights, and we're talking about those brutal deep winter nights, when frost forms on the interior walls and your breath freezes in the air, sleeping alone is genuinely dangerous. Your body can only generate so much heat, and a single human in a large bed, even with all the furs and blankets, might not produce enough warmth to maintain a safe core temperature through the night. The solution is simple, ancient and unsentimental: add more bodies. This isn't about intimacy or romance, though obviously those happen too when spouses share beds. This is about thermal efficiency, about treating human bodies as what they are: biological furnaces that each produce about 100 watts of heat continuously. 2 bodies in a bed create a shared microclimate that's significantly warmer than either body could achieve alone. 3 bodies are even better, though at that point you start running into space limitations and the social complications of who sleeps where and in what configuration. Kings have options that peasants don't. You could summon your wife from her chamber, and on particularly cold nights you do exactly that. Not because you're feeling romantic, though that might happen too, but because shared sleep is shared survival. Royal marriages are political arrangements, everyone knows this. But they're also practical partnerships, and one of the practical benefits is having another warm body available when winter gets serious. Your wife understands this completely. When a servant arrives at her chamber with the message that the king requests her presence, she doesn't assume passion, she assumes the temperature has dropped below tolerable, and you're implementing the 2-body strategy. But you can't always rely on your wife. She has her own health considerations, her own schedule, and sometimes she's travelling or indisposed, or simply doesn't want to make the cold walk from her chamber to yours. In those cases, you have other options. A trusted servant might sleep at the foot of your bed outside the curtains, but close enough that their body heat contributes to the overall thermal situation. This isn't demeaning, it's understood as a service like tending the fire, and servants who perform this duty are often rewarded with extra food or small payments. Children, when they're young, regularly sleep with parents or siblings. Nursemaids sleep with royal infants, not just to monitor them, but to keep them warm. The infant mortality rate in winter is significantly higher than in summer, and one of the contributing factors is cold babies can't regulate their body temperature effectively, and a baby sleeping alone in a cold chamber is a baby at risk. So babies sleep with adults, toddlers sleep with older siblings, and everyone piles together in configurations that maximize warmth and minimize risk. Historians still debate the psychological effects of this communal sleeping, but the thermal benefits are undeniable. Even among adults who aren't family or spouses, sharing sleep space is common and unremarkable. Travellers sharing an inn-room routinely share beds with strangers, 2 to a bed, sometimes 3, if the inn is crowded and the bed is large. It's understood that this is purely practical, that you keep your clothes on, that you're not there for anything except warmth and a place to lie down. Military campaigns involve soldiers sleeping in clusters, sharing body heat in tents or open fields. Monks in monasteries sleep in communal dormitories, not for theological reasons primarily, but because heating individual cells would be impossibly expensive. The economics of body heat are straightforward. One person heats a bed slowly, and might not achieve comfortable warmth before dawn. 2 people heat the same bed twice as fast and reach a stable warm state that persists through the night. 3 people create so much heat that you might actually need fewer blankets, and on truly brutal nights, large families in small cottages will sleep in one big pile, parents, children, grandparents, all together in a communal thermal mass that keeps everyone alive. Your bed is large enough for 3 people, comfortably 4 if they're willing to be cozy about it. Tonight you're alone, or rather you're planning to be alone unless the temperature drops further and you change your mind. There's no shame in summoning company for warmth. Even the church, which has opinions about pretty much everything involving beds and bodies, acknowledges that survival trumps propriety. There are documented cases of priests sharing beds with travellers during storms of nuns, sleeping in groups during harsh winters, all with the explicit approval of religious authorities, because the alternative is corpses, and corpses serve nobody's theological agenda. Dogs are another option, and you've used this strategy more than once. A large hunting dog produces significant heat, maybe 150 watts for a big animal, and dogs naturally seek warmth just like humans do. Invite a dog into your bed, and it'll burrow into the blankets, curl up against your legs or back, and stay there all night radiating heat and occasionally snoring. Some nobles keep dogs specifically for this purpose, not hunting dogs or guard dogs, but bed dogs, companion animals whose primary job is to be warm. Your grandfather supposedly slept with 3 dogs every winter night, arranged around him like furry heating elements. The social hierarchy extends even to bed-sharing arrangements. A king sharing a bed with his queen is expected. A king sharing with a trusted servant is acceptable in extreme circumstances. A king sharing with a dog is slightly amusing but perfectly normal. But there are limits you can't share with just anyone, because the intimacy of sleep, even purely thermal sleep, creates a kind of vulnerability that has political implications. Who you trust enough to sleep beside, even innocently, sends messages about alliances and favour. There's also the practical consideration of compatibility. Some people thrash in their sleep kick snore like they're sawing logs. Sharing a bed with them is choosing between warmth and actual sleep quality, and sometimes the calculus doesn't work out. Your wife is a good bed partner. She sleeps quietly, doesn't move much, radiates a steady, pleasant warmth. You've had servants who were less compatible, who made so much noise or moved so frequently that you sent them away and decided to brave the cold alone rather than deal with the disturbance. The medieval understanding of the body includes the concept of natural heat, the internal fire that keeps you alive that medieval physicians believed was concentrated in the heart and needed to be maintained through food, drink, and external warmth. When 2 bodies share a bed, their natural heats combined support each other, create a collective life force that's stronger than either individual. It's poetic, sure, but it's also based on observable reality. Sleeping alone, you might wake up cold and stiff. Sleeping with another person, you wake up warm and loose-limbed, your muscles relaxed, your body grateful for the thermal support. Tonight, you're starting alone. The bed is yours, the space is yours, and your single body will have to generate all the heat this sleeping space needs. But you know, and everyone in the castle knows, that if the wind picks up, if the temperature drops further, if you wake during that midnight waking and can't get warm again, you can call for company. It's not weakness, it's not failure. It's just medieval life, where warmth is a resource that gets shared like bread or wine, and nobody survives winter by pretending to be self-sufficient. While you're arranging yourself under the furs, preparing for that first descent into sleep, there's someone else in the room who won't be sleeping at all tonight. The fire tender, the young servant we mentioned earlier, is settling onto his stool near the hearth for what will be an 8-hour vigil. His job is simple in concept and brutal in execution. Keep the fire alive, keep you alive, stay awake through the entire night, while exhaustion pulls at him like an undertow. This isn't optional service or a rotating duty that'll change next week. This is his position, his role in the household hierarchy, and if he fails, consequences range from dismissal to disaster. He's maybe 15 years old, this boy, the son of a freeman who works in your stables. He was chosen for this position partly because he's responsible, and partly because his father has served your family for decades and earned the privilege of having his son placed in an indoor position where the work is hard, but at least he's not freezing in the stables. The boy has been training for this role for 2 years, learning the temperament of different woods, understanding how to read a fire's mood, developing the instinct that tells him when another log is needed, without having to consciously think about it. His stool is positioned close enough to the fire that he benefits from its heat, but far enough back that sparks won't land on him. He's wearing wool, of course everything is wool in winter, and he has a heavy blanket wrapped around his shoulders that he's allowed to use as long as he doesn't fall asleep. That's the trick, the terrible balance: stay warm enough that you don't become dangerously cold yourself, but not so comfortable that sleep becomes irresistible. He'll spend the night in a state of controlled discomfort, too cold to fully relax, too warm to become desperate, walking a narrow line between extremes. The fire itself demands constant attention. Every hour, sometimes more frequently, it needs feeding, but you can't just throw a log on whenever you feel like it. The timing matters. Add wood too early and you smother the coals, reducing heat output. Add it too late, and the fire dies down to embers that are hard to revive. The fire tender watches the flames, reads the colour, and height observes how the current logs are burning. When he sees the right moment, when active flames have consumed enough of the existing wood, that there's space and heat to accept new fuel, he reaches for the next log. The wood is stacked within easy reach, arranged by size, so he can select the appropriate piece without having to get up and search. Large logs for the long burns, medium pieces for maintaining steady heat, small splits for reviving a fire that's dying. He uses long iron tongs to position the wood, never his hands, because even experienced fire tenders occasionally misjudge and get burned. You can see the scars on his forearms from training accidents, small white lines where hot metal touch skin, badges of learning that every fire tender collects. Between feedings he fights sleep. This is the real challenge, the part that separates adequate fire tenders from excellent ones. The warmth is hypnotic, the crackling sounds are soothing, and his body desperately wants to rest. He has techniques. He shifts position, frequently stands up and walks a few steps, splashes water from a bucket onto his face when the drowsiness gets really bad. Some fire tenders quietly recite prayers or songs, using the mental engagement to stay alert. Others keep their eyes moving, watching the fire, then the walls, then the door, creating a pattern of attention that prevents the mind from drifting. He's also acting as a security measure, though nobody says this explicitly. A king sleeping behind bed curtains is vulnerable. Fire tenders have stopped assassination attempts simply by being awake and alert when intruders tried to enter the chamber. They've raised alarms for medical emergencies when the king's breathing changed, or he called out in distress. They're witnesses to the king's private moments, the nightmares, the prayers, the midnight conversations with wives, or God, and they're chosen partly for their discretion. A good fire tender sees everything and remembers nothing, at least nothing he'd repeat outside the chamber. The monotony is its own form of torture. 8 hours is a long time to sit relatively still, performing the same task repeatedly, never allowed to fully rest. Modern people might compare it to a boring security guard shift, but it's worse, because there's no coffee, no smartphone, no one to talk to. Just a teenage boy, a fire, and the weight of responsibility. If the fire dies, the king could freeze. If the king freezes, the boy's father loses his position, the family loses their security, and the boy himself might face charges of negligence that could result in beating or worse. Historians still debate how common this practice was. Did every noble have a dedicated fire tender, or was this a luxury only kings could afford? Account books suggest that large households routinely employed night servants, and fire tending appears frequently in lists of duties and payments. Smaller households might have had family members take turns, or they might have simply banked their fires before bed, covering them with ash to slow the burn and hope for the best. Banking works reasonably well, but produces less heat, and there's always the risk that the fire goes completely out and you wake up to a cold dead hearth and hours of work to get it started again. The fire tender also maintains the room's candles if any are still burning, though usually you've extinguished them before getting into bed. Candles are expensive, tallow candles smell terrible, but a cheap beeswax candles smell pleasant, but cost significantly more, and there's no point wasting them while you sleep. The fire provides enough light for the tender to do his job, casting dancing shadows that make the chamber feel alive, populated by shapes that move and shift, but never quite resolve into anything identifiable. He can hear you breathing behind the bed curtains once you fall asleep. Everyone's breathing changes during sleep, becomes deeper, more regular, sometimes includes snoring or the small sounds people make when they dream. The fire tender learns to recognize these patterns, can tell from the quality of your breathing whether you're asleep or just resting, whether you're sleeping deeply or restlessly. It's intimate knowledge, the kind that comes from spending hundreds of nights in the same room with someone, and it creates a strange bond. You trust him with your life every night, and he bears that trust by staying awake when everything in his body screams for sleep. Around dawn, when the first grey light starts appearing around the window shutters, his shift finally ends. Another servant arrives to take over, not for fire tending anymore since you'll wake soon, but for morning duties, preparing your clothes, organising the chamber. The night tender gives a brief report. The fire burned well, the king slept soundly, nothing unusual occurred. Then he stumbles off to wherever servants sleep, probably falling into bed, still wearing his wool and sleeping until afternoon, before waking to do it all again tomorrow night. You don't think about him much, this boy who keeps you alive. He's part of the infrastructure like the walls and the hearth and the tapestries, but right now as you settle into your first sleep, he's there, awake, watching, feeding the fire, making sure that when the cold comes prowling through the stone corridors looking for victims, it doesn't find the king of this realm. The fire pops, the boy shifts on his stool, you close your eyes, the night has just begun. Now let's talk about what happens when nature calls in the middle of the night because your body doesn't care about the cold or your comfort or the layers of furs you've carefully arranged. You're going to need to urinate at some point, probably during that midnight waking. We discussed earlier, possibly more than once if you drank wine before bed, or if you're getting older and your bladder doesn't hold what it used to. And this presents a problem because leaving the warm cocoon of your bed means exposing yourself to chamber air that's cold enough to make you gasp, cold enough that the shock of it can actually make falling back asleep difficult even after you've returned to the furs. The solution sits maybe 6 feet from your bed, a chamber pot, ceramic or metal sitting on a wooden stand with a cloth cover to contain the smell. Some chamber pots are elaborate painted porcelain decorated with family crests or religious imagery, because apparently even your excretory functions need to reflect your status. Yours is relatively simple, glazed ceramic, sturdy with a wide mouth and a comfortable rim. It's been emptied and cleaned earlier today by a servant whose entire job involves managing the castle's waste, a position that's low status but essential, and surprisingly well paid, because nobody wants to do it and everyone needs it done. When the urge comes, you have a choice. You can try to hold it, hoping you'll fall back asleep and the need will diminish. This sometimes works, but often doesn't, and lying in bed with a full bladder is its own form of torture. Or you can acknowledge reality, accept the inevitable cold exposure, and just get it over with. Most nights, after putting it off as long as possible, you choose the second option. The process begins by opening the bed curtains, and immediately you feel the temperature difference. It's like opening a refrigerator door. Cold air rushing into your warm space, warm air escaping out into the chamber. You move quickly, because every second the curtains are open is heat loss. You'll have to recover later. Swing your legs out from under the furs and even through your wool stockings. You feel the platform's wood cold and hard. Stand up and the full weight of the chamber's chill hits you. Your nightshirt suddenly inadequate, your body's warmth fleeing like it's betraying you. The chamber robe is right there on its stand and you grab it, pulling it around your shoulders. But even this doesn't fully compensate for the shock of leaving bed. Your breath is visible now. You're generating little clouds with each exhalation, and if you had a light you'd see them clearly. The fire is still burning, your fire tender is still awake on his stool, but the hearth's warmth doesn't extend this far. The chamber's centre is a cold zone, a thermal no man's land that you have to cross to reach the chamber pot. You shuffle toward the pot, no need for dignity, nobody's watching except the fire tender, who knows better than to look directly at the king during private moments, and the floor is cold even through stockings. In the absolute worst conditions, there's sometimes a thin layer of ice on the flagstones invisible, but slippery because moisture from breath, and the hearth condenses and freezes in the coldest spots. You've heard stories about elderly nobles falling during midnight chamber pot visits, breaking hips or hitting their heads, and suddenly what should be a simple bodily function becomes a genuine hazard. The chamber pot itself is cold to the touch, the ceramic holding the room's chill like stone holds it in the walls. You do what needs to be done, and here's an unpleasant detail: sometimes on the coldest nights, there's already ice in the chamber pot. If it wasn't emptied late enough in the evening, if there was residual moisture, it can freeze solid. Your urine hits this ice and creates a disturbing sound, and the steam rising from the pot is immediate and dramatic, a visible reminder of the temperature difference between inside your body and outside it. Medieval people understood that urine had diagnostic value. Physicians examined it for colour, clarity and smell as indicators of health. But at midnight you're not thinking about medicine, you're thinking about finishing as quickly as possible and getting back to bed. Some people use bedpans, shallow metal or ceramic pans that can be used while still in bed, minimising cold exposure. But bedpans are tricky, prone to spilling and create a mess that's worse than the cold. You've tried them and decided the walk to the chamber pot is the lesser evil. There's always the possibility of more serious needs. Urination is inconvenient, defecation is a full crisis. For that, you'd need to visit the garderobe, a small closet built into the castle wall, with a stone seat that has a hole opening to a shaft that drops stories down to a cesspit or moat. Garderobes are positioned to take advantage of the same drafts that make chambers cold, using airflow to carry smells away. But using a garderobe at night means leaving your chamber entirely, walking through cold corridors, exposing yourself to even worse conditions. Most people try to avoid this, timing their meals and bowel movements to happen during daylight hours. If you absolutely must use the garderobe at night, you take a servant with you carrying a candle or lamp, because dark corridors in castles are dangerous. Uneven floors, unexpected steps, the risk of running into something or someone you shouldn't. The garderobe itself is brutally cold. The draft that normally provides ventilation in summer feels like Arctic wind in winter, and the stone seat is so cold that skin contact is genuinely painful. You do your business as quickly as physically possible and flee back to your chamber like you're escaping an assault. Some chamber pots have lids which helps contain smell, but creates another problem. The lid handle is cold, and touching it with sleek, clumsy fingers is unpleasant enough that you sometimes skip it. The smell isn't terrible yet, urine fresh and diluted from evening wine, but by morning it'll be stronger, and the servant who empties chamber pots has to deal with hours of accumulated waste from multiple people. Medieval castles have a base smell, a background odour that combines smoke, unwashed bodies, animal presence, and yes, the faint evidence of human waste. You've lived with it so long you barely notice, but visitors from cleaner, better ventilated buildings sometimes visibly react. Finish with the chamber pot, and now comes the return journey. Shuffle back across the cold floor, shed the chamber robe, climb back onto the bed platform, open the curtains just enough to slip through and immediately pull them shut again. Burrow back under the furs and you're shocked by how much heat you've lost. The bed is still warm from your earlier presence, but it's not as warm, and your extremities are cold now. Feet, hands, face all radiating chill into the space you've spent hours warming up. It'll take 15 or 20 minutes to recover, to stop shivering, to feel genuinely comfortable again. This is why some people simply hold it all night despite the discomfort. The calculation is straightforward: temporary bladder pressure versus guaranteed cold exposure and heat loss. Different people make different choices, and those choices can change with age, health, and how cold the particular night is. On moderately cold nights, you'll make the trip. On brutally cold nights, you've been known to hold it until dawn, accepting the discomfort as preferable to the alternative. The chamber pot will sit there until morning, when a servant enters and removes it, without comment, taking it away to be emptied and cleaned and returned before the next evening. It's part of the invisible infrastructure of noble life, the unglamorous necessities that ballads never mention, but that shape every single night. You arrange yourself back under the furs, pulling them up to your chin, waiting for warmth to return. The fire tender pokes the hearth, adding another log. The night continues. Your bladder for now is empty. It's the small victories that matter when you're trying to survive until dawn. Let's turn our attention to the window, that architectural necessity that's also a thermal catastrophe. Your chamber has one window positioned on the south wall to maximize daylight during short winter days, and it's both a blessing and a curse. During daytime, it provides light that candles can't match, and ventilation that keeps the room from becoming completely toxic with smoke and human odours. At night, it becomes a gaping wound in your defences, a portal through which cold pours into the chamber like an invading army. Glass windows exist in your time. You've seen them in churches, in the homes of the wealthiest merchants, but they're rare enough that having glass windows in a bedchamber would be an almost obscene display of wealth. Glass needs to be imported from Venice or Normandy, transported carefully, because it breaks easily, and installed by craftsmen who understand how to set panes in lead channels. The cost is staggering: multiple years of a skilled worker's wages for a single modest window. Even you, a king, don't have glass in your bedchamber. What you have instead is a compromise, a solution that sort of works but never works well. Your window opening is maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, sized to let in adequate light, without creating a hole so large it can't be adequately covered. During the day, it's covered with oiled cloth linen that's been soaked in linseed oil until it becomes translucent, letting light through while blocking wind and rain. Oiled cloth is the poor man's glass, and by poor man, we mean everyone except cathedral builders and merchant princes. It works reasonably well in that it's better than nothing, but it's far from perfect. The problem is that oiled cloth, no matter how carefully installed, always has gaps. The frame it's mounted on expands and contracts with temperature changes. The cloth itself becomes brittle in cold weather, sometimes cracking. The oil preserves it against rot but doesn't make it airtight, and wind finds every microscopic imperfection, every tiny gap where cloth meets frame. Stand near the window during a storm and you can actually feel distinct jets of cold air penetrating the chamber, like tiny frozen fingers probing for warmth to steal. At night you have additional protection: wooden shutters that close from the inside, heavy oak panels that swing on iron hinges and latch with a bar. When closed, these shutters block the oiled cloth completely, creating a double barrier between you and the outside world. But wood isn't airtight either, and shutters are built to fit snugly but not perfectly, because wood swells when wet and shrinks when dry, and if you built them too tight, they wouldn't open or close properly when conditions changed. So there are gaps, always gaps, and through those gaps the winter wind finds its way. The shutters are closed now, your servant made sure of that before you began your bedtime preparations, but you can hear the wind testing them, probing, making the wood creak slightly as air pressure changes. On stormy nights, really violent storm shutters have been known to blow open despite being latched, and the sudden influx of wind and rain can extinguish the hearth fire if you're unlucky. Your shutters are strong, well-maintained, but you still hear stories about other castles where inferior construction led to disaster. Some people try to improve the situation with additional measures. You've seen nobles hang heavy curtains over the entire window wall, creating another air gap, another thermal barrier. Others stuff the gaps around shutters with wool or moss or rags. Though this is temporary, by midwinter the stuffing has dried and shrunk and fallen out, and someone has to climb up and replace it. Some castles have interior wooden panels that can be installed over windows for the winter season, essentially creating triple protection oiled cloth shutters and removable panels. But panels are heavy, storage is limited, and installation is labour intensive. The window also creates a cold zone in the chamber that's noticeable even from across the room. Cold air is heavy, as we've mentioned, and it pours through window gaps and literally flows down the wall like invisible water pooling on the floor below. Your bed is positioned as far from the window as the chamber's layout allows, but even so you can feel the temperature gradient. The side of the bed nearest the window is noticeably colder than the side nearest the hearth, and you've learned to sleep oriented so your head is away from the window and toward the fire. Historians still argue about whether medieval people had an accurate understanding of how heat and cold moved through buildings. They didn't have modern thermodynamics, obviously, but they had centuries of trial and error, generations of people paying attention to what worked and what didn't. The way they positioned beds, hung tapestries, and oriented furniture suggests they understood draughts, convection, and thermal radiation, even if they didn't have scientific terminology for these concepts. The worst nights are when wind and cold combine. Wind doesn't just bring cold, it drives it through every crack and gap, forces it into spaces that would normally be protected. Wind also creates noise, whistling and moaning through castle corridors, making shutters rattle, sometimes producing sounds that are genuinely eerie. Medieval people attributed these sounds to spirits or demons, and while you're educated enough to know it's just wind, that doesn't make the sounds less unsettling at 3 a.m. when you're half awake and disoriented. There are documented cases of windows causing serious problems. Frost accumulates on the inside surface of shutters, and if that frost melts from a fire being built up too hot from a sudden temperature swing, you get water dripping down the wall, soaking the floor, rushes creating damp that breeds mold and respiratory problems. Some mornings you've woken to find intricate ice patterns on the interior of your shutters, beautiful and terrifying evidence of just how cold the night was. In summer, of course, the window situation reverses. Then you're grateful for every gap, every draught, anything that moves air and provides cooling. Summer in a stone castle can be oppressive. The same thermal mass that makes winter so brutal makes summer stuffy and hot. Shutters stay open day and night, oiled cloth gets rolled up or removed entirely, and everyone wishes for more windows, bigger windows, anything to increase airflow. But that's a problem for future you months away. Right now, in the depths of winter, the window is an enemy, a weak point in your defences that you monitor constantly. You can't see the window from your bed, the curtains block your view, and anyway, the chamber is dark except for firelight, but you know it's there. You can hear it, feel its presence in the way the chamber's cold seems to emanate from that direction. The shutters creak slightly. The wind finds a gap and whistles through it, a thin, high sound that cuts through the fire's crackling. Your fire tender glances at the window, checking, always checking, because if those shutters fail, if the wind gets in, the fire might die, and then everyone's in trouble. The window holds. For now it holds. That's all you can ask for. Even with all your precautions, all your servants, all your furs and fires and carefully maintained thermal defences, you're going to get sick. It's inevitable. Cold chambers mean constant low-level respiratory stress, and respiratory stress means coughs, chest congestion fevers that arrive in November and don't fully clear until April. You're currently healthy, or as healthy as anyone gets in medieval winter, but you've been through this enough times to know what's coming. Everyone gets winter sick. The question isn't if, but when and how bad. Medieval medicine has theories about this entire systems of explanation that sound bizarre to modern ears but represent genuine attempts to understand disease. The dominant theory is humoral medicine inherited from ancient Greek physicians like Galen, and it holds that your body contains 4 humours: blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile that must remain in balance for health. Winter being cold and wet produces excess phlegm, which accumulates in the lungs and head, causing the symptoms you experience as colds and coughs. The cure theoretically is to rebalance the humours through diet herbs and sometimes bloodletting, though you've learned to be sceptical of treatments that make you feel worse before they make you feel better. Your physician, when you summon him for winter ailments, will examine your urine check, your pulse, possibly smell your breath, and ask detailed questions about your stools. He's looking for signs of humoral imbalance, and his treatments reflect his diagnostic conclusions. For excess phlegm, he might recommend warming foods, spices like ginger and pepper wine, heated with cinnamon roasted meats rather than boiled. He'll tell you to avoid cold wet foods like most fruits and salads, which in winter you're avoiding anyway because they're not available. Herbal remedies are everywhere in medieval medicine. For coughs, your physician might prescribe a syrup made from honey horehound and licorice root boiled together until thick and taken by the spoonful. For chest congestion, a poultice of mustard seeds and lard applied to the chest, creating heat that supposedly draws out the excess phlegm. For fever, willow bark tea, which actually works because willow contains salicylic acid, the compound that becomes aspirin, though nobody in your time knows why it works, they just know that it does most of the time. Some treatments are more dramatic and less pleasant. Bloodletting, opening a vein to release bad blood, is common for serious illnesses based on the theory that removing blood also removes the humour that's out of balance. You've undergone this procedure several times, watching dark blood drain into a bowl, while your physician monitors the amount carefully, not wanting to take too much. Does it help? You honestly can't tell. You always feel weak afterward, which the physician explains as the body adjusting to its new balance. And sometimes you do feel better a few days later though, whether that's because of the bloodletting or despite it is impossible to know. The cold chamber itself becomes a medical concern when you're ill. Your physician might order the fire built up higher than usual, the room heated as much as possible because heat is considered therapeutic for cold-related diseases. But overheating creates its own problems. Dry air makes coughs worse, excessive smoke irritates lungs, and if you sweat too much, you're supposedly losing vital humours. There's a careful balance to maintain, and your servants watch you constantly when you're sick, adjusting fires and blankets based on whether you're feverish or chilled. Steam treatments are popular and actually somewhat effective. A bowl of hot water infused with herbs, thyme, eucalyptus, if you can get it chamomile, placed near your bed, a cloth draped over your head, and the bowl to trap the steam, forcing you to breathe hot, humid, herb-scented air. This does help loosen chest congestion, makes breathing easier temporarily, though it's uncomfortable, and makes you feel like you're suffocating until you adjust to it. Some physicians recommend adding wine to the water or burning specific woods in the fire, believing different smokes have different medicinal properties. Historians still debate how many medieval ailments were what we'd call colds and flu versus more serious diseases like pneumonia or tuberculosis. The symptoms overlap, and medieval diagnostic categories don't map neatly onto modern ones. What you call winter fever might be influenza. What you call lung sickness might be bacterial pneumonia, and sometimes people die from what started as a simple cold, because there are no antibiotics, no modern interventions, just herbal remedies and prayers and hope. Prayer is its own form of medicine, and nobody in your world questions this. When you're sick, your private chaplain says specific prayers for healing, sometimes incorporating relics, a fragment of a saint's bone, a piece of cloth that supposedly touched a holy person that are believed to have healing power. You've got several relics in your chamber kept in ornate containers, and when you're ill they're brought closer to your bed, positioned where their spiritual influence can supposedly reach you. Does this work? You believe it does, or at least you believe it might, and belief itself has power, even if the mechanism remains mysterious. The vulnerability of being sick in a cold chamber creates genuine fear. You've seen people die from winter illnesses, cousins, advisors, servants who started with a simple cough and were dead within a week. Death from respiratory illness is common enough that it's almost mundane. Expected, one of the ways medieval people exit the world, along with childbirth complications, injuries that fester, and the various plagues that periodically sweep through populations. When you develop a cough in December, there's always the question, is this just winter sick, or is this the beginning of something worse? Your servants know to watch for warning signs. A cough that produces bloody sputum is serious. A fever that persists for more than a few days is serious. Breathing that becomes laboured with visible effort required for each breath is very serious. If these symptoms appear, your physician moves into your chamber, sleeping there to monitor you constantly, and priests are quietly notified to be ready for last rites just in case. It sounds dramatic, but death from respiratory illness can happen quickly, and everyone knows someone who seemed fine one day and was gasping their last breaths 3 days later. The cold amplifies everything. A minor illness that would be uncomfortable in summer becomes dangerous in winter because your body is already stressed from constant cold exposure, already working overtime just to maintain core temperature. Adding infection on top of that stress can push people past their limits. Children and the elderly die disproportionately in winter, their bodies less able to handle the combined assault of cold and disease. So you take prevention seriously. You avoid unnecessary cold exposure when possible. You eat warming foods, drink wine that supposedly strengthens blood, take the herbs your physician recommends even when they taste terrible. You pray because prayer is prevention as much as cure, and you watch yourself for early symptoms. The scratch in your throat, the slight fatigue, the first cough, knowing that catching illness early gives you the best chance of surviving it. The fire crackles. Your throat feels fine tonight. You're healthy for now. That's enough. That has to be enough. When guests visit your castle in winter, they face a reality that never appears in the formal descriptions of hospitality. An honour guest chambers are significantly colder than your own, and that's entirely intentional. You have limited resources, limited firewood, limited servants, limited warm spaces, and those resources get allocated according to strict hierarchy. You, the king, get the best chamber, the most attention, the warmest possible conditions. Your family comes next. Important guests receive adequate accommodation. Less important guests get whatever's left, which in winter often means rooms that are barely more comfortable than sleeping outdoors. The guest chambers are typically in older sections of the castle, farther from the kitchens, where residual cooking heat provides some warmth, positioned to receive less attention from servants who are already stretched thin managing the main household. A visiting baron might get a room with a small hearth, and one servant assigned to maintain it, but that servant is also managing 2 or 3 other guest fires, which means the attention is divided, the fires are smaller, the warmth is rationed. A visiting knight gets even less, maybe a brazier with charcoal instead of a proper hearth, maybe just extra blankets and wishes for good luck. The guest chambers have the same structural problems as yours: stone walls, inadequate windows, drafts that find every gap, but without the accumulated improvements that your chamber has acquired over decades. Your tapestries are thick and well maintained. Guest chambers might have thinner hangings or older ones with moth holes, or in some cases just painted walls, because tapestries are expensive, and guests might damage them or even steal them if they're unscrupulous. Your bed has multiple feather mattresses and the finest furs. Guest beds have straw mattresses with maybe 1 thin feather layer wool blankets, instead of furs, functional but Spartan. Historians still debate whether this disparity was intentional power display or simple resource limitation. The answer is probably both. You genuinely don't have enough quality bedding, enough firewood, enough servants to give everyone royal treatment. But you also don't want to. Comfort is a form of currency in medieval politics, and rationing it carefully sends messages about favour, importance and hierarchy. The ambassador from France gets a better chamber than the representative from a minor duchy. The bishop who supports your policies gets more firewood than the bishop who's been causing problems. Guests understand this system and don't openly complain, because complaining about hospitality is considered deeply rude, a violation of social contracts that govern noble behaviour. But they feel it, they notice and they remember. A cold, uncomfortable night in your castle becomes part of political calculation, factoring into future alliances, trade agreements, marriage negotiations. You froze at King Edward's castle, so perhaps you're less inclined to support his next request for military aid. It's soft power exercised through temperature control. Some guests come prepared. Experienced travellers bring their own bedding, fur-lined sleeping bags, essentially portable warmth that doesn't rely on host generosity. They bring servants whose job is specifically to secure the best possible accommodation, to negotiate for better rooms, to acquire extra firewood through whatever means necessary, including bribery or theft. Medieval hospitality is theoretically governed by elaborate codes of honour, but in practice it's often a negotiation, sometimes a quiet battle, where hosts try to minimise resource expenditure and guests try to maximize comfort. The worst accommodations go to unexpected guests, people who arrive without warning and must be housed despite no advance preparation. These unfortunate visitors might end up in rooms that haven't been heated in months, where the hearths are full of old ash and need cleaning before they can even be lit, where the bedding smells of mould and mice have nested in the mattress straw. You've housed such guests yourself. You can't turn away a nobleman who arrives claiming urgent business, even if you suspect he's just seeking shelter from a storm, and you know they spend miserable nights probably barely sleeping, definitely complaining to their companions about your inadequate hospitality. Sometimes guests double up sharing chambers and even beds to make room for everyone. This happens during large gatherings, weddings, councils, religious festivals when your castle fills beyond capacity. Two minor nobles sharing a bed isn't unusual, and while they might prefer privacy, shared body heat at least provides survival benefits. The alternative is sleeping in the Great Hall with dozens of others, which some people actually prefer because the collective body heat and larger fire create warmer conditions than isolated chambers, though at the cost of privacy and dignity. There are strategic considerations too. Guests you trust sleep closer to your own chambers within earshot of your guards. Guests you're uncertain about get rooms farther away, harder for them to reach you quickly if they have hostile intentions. Guests from rival houses might deliberately get adjacent rooms where you can monitor whether they're meeting secretly and plotting against you. The physical layout of guest accommodation is a map of political relationships, readable by anyone who understands the code. Your own comfort relative to your guest's discomfort also serves a purpose. It reminds everyone subtly but constantly of power dynamics. You wake up relatively warm after a decent night's sleep. Your guests wake up stiff cold, exhausted their bodies, reminding them that they're in your house, under your protection, dependent on your resources. When they meet you for breakfast in the Great Hall, the contrast is visible. You're refreshed and commanding, while they're still trying to warm up and recover. It's not fair, but fairness isn't the point. Power is the point, and temperature is one of its most effective tools. Some guests never get invited back. If they were particularly difficult, demanding, or politically problematic, they might find future invitations scarce or non-existent. Others become regular visitors, forming relationships that span decades, and you might gradually improve their accommodations as the relationship strengthens. A better chamber, more firewood, finer blankets. These upgrades are noticed and appreciated, serving as tangible evidence of growing favour and alliance. The servants who manage guest chambers are typically lower status than those who serve you directly. They're less experienced, less attentive, more likely to forget to add a log to the fire, or fail to notice when a guest needs something. This isn't malicious, it's just resource allocation. Your best servants focus on you. Adequate servants handle guests, and guests get what they get and learn to accept it or make alternative arrangements next time. Medieval hospitality is a complex performance where warmth, literal thermal warmth, plays a starring role. You're the director of this performance, controlling who gets comfort and who endures hardship, using temperature as a language that communicates favour, hierarchy and power without anyone having to say it explicitly. The visiting Earl, who's shivering in his chamber right now, understands perfectly what's being communicated. He'll remember this night when you ask him for support next spring. Cold has a long memory, and so do people who've experienced it while sleeping in your guest chambers. Among all the people in your castle, there are certain groups who receive priority when it comes to warmth and protection from the cold, and this prioritization isn't just sentiment, it's survival strategy based on harsh demographic reality. Children, the elderly, and anyone weakened by illness or injury die first when winter gets serious. Their bodies can't generate or maintain heat as effectively as healthy adults. Their immune systems can't fight off the respiratory infections that cold chambers breed, and once they start declining, the slide toward death happens frighteningly fast. So you allocate resources accordingly, concentrating warmth where it'll do the most good, where it'll prevent the deaths that are preventable. Children sleep closest to hearths always. In your own household, the nursery is positioned on an interior wall of the castle, flanked by other heated rooms, creating a thermal buffer between the children and the outside. The nursery hearth burns larger than guest chamber fires, maintained by a dedicated servant who understands that letting this particular fire die isn't just a fireable offence, it's potentially a death sentence for royal heirs. Infants especially are terrifyingly vulnerable. They can't regulate their own body temperature effectively until they're several months old, and a baby who gets too cold can die within hours, their tiny bodies simply giving up when overwhelmed by thermal stress. Nursemaids sleep in the nursery, their bodies providing additional warmth, their presence ensuring constant monitoring. These aren't young servants. Nursemaids are typically older women, often mothers or grandmothers themselves, chosen for experience and reliability over youth and energy. They know how to check if a baby is too cold by touching the back of the neck, how to add blankets without risk of suffocation, how to recognize the warning signs that a child is in trouble. Medieval infant mortality is staggering. Perhaps 1 in 3 children dies before age 5, and while many deaths are from disease or accidents, cold is a contributing factor that vigilant care can sometimes prevent. Older children, toddlers, and young adolescents often sleep together in groups. This serves multiple purposes: shared body heat, socialization, supervision, efficiency. Your own children, when they were younger, slept 3 to a bed, despite having space for individual sleeping arrangements, because the collective warmth and companionship provided benefits that outweighed any loss of privacy. Siblings become survival partners, their bodies creating a warm cluster that resists cold more effectively than any single child could manage alone. This also teaches cooperation and interdependence values that medieval society considers essential. The elderly face different but equally serious challenges. Older bodies generate less heat, circulation diminishes, joints stiffen in cold weather, making movement difficult and falls more likely. Your elderly mother, when she was still alive, had chambers positioned near the kitchen for residual warmth, with servants specifically assigned to monitor her fire through the night. She wore more layers than younger people, sometimes sleeping in her daytime dress, with additional robes piled on top because the effort of undressing and redressing was more exhausting than the slight discomfort of sleeping clothed. Old people also tend to wake more frequently during the night, whether from bladder needs, pain from arthritic joints, or simply lighter sleep patterns, and each waking means potential cold exposure. Your mother's chamber had a brazier positioned close to her bed, glowing coals that could provide immediate warmth when she woke, reducing the shock of midnight chamber pot visits. She also had a companion who slept in her chamber, both for warmth sharing and for immediate help if she needed something or fell during the night. Pregnant women receive special consideration, their status as vessels for future heirs, warranting extra resources. Your wife during her pregnancies moved to warmer chambers, ate special warming foods, and had her hearth maintained at higher temperatures than normal. Medieval medicine held that cold could harm the developing child, possibly causing miscarriage or deformity, so keeping pregnant women warm wasn't just comfort, it was protecting dynastic succession. The correlation isn't entirely wrong. Modern medicine confirms that extreme cold stress can affect pregnancy outcomes, though the mechanism isn't the humoral imbalance medieval physicians proposed. People recovering from illness or injury also get priority. A knight who broke his leg in a tournament, a servant who developed pneumonia, anyone whose body is already fighting one battle doesn't need the additional stress of fighting cold. They're moved to warmer chambers when possible, given extra blankets monitored constantly, because setbacks during recovery can be fatal. Medieval people understand intuitively what modern medicine confirms. Healing requires energy, and bodies struggling to maintain temperature have less energy available for repair and recovery. There's a practical calculation underlying this prioritization. Children are future resources. They'll grow into adults who work. Fight bare, more children continue family lines. The elderly have wisdom, experience, connections, sometimes wealth or political value that justifies investment in their survival. Pregnant women carry heirs. The injured or ill, if they recover, return to productive roles. These aren't purely economic calculations. Medieval people do genuinely care about family members, feel affection and duty, but the economics reinforce the emotional imperatives. Contrast this with how society treats those considered expendable. Criminals imprisoned in castle dungeons face the worst conditions, underground cells that never see sun, that fill with water when it rains, where cold is a form of punishment and death. From exposure is considered acceptable, even desirable. Beggars who sleep in church porches or under bridges die in winter, and their bodies aren't discovered until spring thaw. Travelling merchants who can't afford inn fees sometimes freeze in their carts. Medieval society has clear hierarchies of human worth, and those hierarchies become visible, tangible, and lethal when measured in degrees of warmth. The vulnerability of children and elders also creates opportunities for moral reflection. Winter deaths of the innocent, a baby who catches cold and dies despite careful nursing. An elderly grandfather who doesn't wake up one January morning provoke questions about divine justice suffering and the nature of a world where good people freeze despite everyone's best efforts. Priests offer theological explanations involving original sin, God's mysterious plan, and the promise of eternal warmth in heaven. These explanations provide some comfort, though they don't bring back the dead or make the next winter any less dangerous. You've personally lost siblings to winter illness, seen nieces and nephews buried after cold seasons, watched elderly advisors decline and die when their bodies couldn't handle another February. Each death reinforces the importance of prioritization of concentrating limited resources where they'll save the most lives. It's not that you don't care about everyone, it's that caring without strategic allocation means more deaths overall. The harsh arithmetic of medieval winter demands choices that feel cruel, but are actually the most merciful option available given the constraints you face. Right now, somewhere in your castle, children are sleeping in the warmest chambers you can provide, elderly relatives are being monitored by attentive servants, and vulnerable individuals are receiving the extra blankets, the better food, the closer attention that might keep them alive until spring. It's not perfect. Some will still die, but the system refined over generations saves more than it loses, and that's the best that medieval technology and resources can achieve. The fire in your own chamber burns steady. The fire tender watches, and in the nursery down the hall your youngest child sleeps warm and safe for tonight at least. That's worth all the firewood in your forests. The way people sleep in winter varies dramatically depending on where in Europe you find yourself, and these regional differences aren't just curiosity, they're adaptations to fundamentally different challenges. Your castle is in England where winter means damp, cold, persistent rain, and temperatures that hover just above or below freezing for months. But travel north to Scandinavia, south to the Mediterranean or east, toward the continent's interior, and you'll find entirely different strategies for surviving the night. Different technologies, different traditions, all responding to the specific character of a local winter. In the far north, Norway, Sweden, the upper reaches of Scotland, the cold is more severe but also drier, and this changes everything. Northern castles and manor houses develop different architectural solutions, including the concept of the warm room, or stew, a single heavily insulated chamber where the entire household essentially lives during deepest winter. The stew has a massive central hearth, or a ceramic tile stove that stores heat more efficiently than open fireplaces radiating warmth for hours after the fire dies down. Everyone sleeps in or near the stew during brutal cold snaps, abandoning privacy for survival, and this creates a different social dynamic, more communal, less hierarchical, at least when winter gets serious. Northern traditions also include sleeping platforms built above hearths, essentially shelves positioned where rising heat accumulates. These platforms can be uncomfortably warm, almost stifling, but that's considered preferable to freezing, and people rotate through the warmest sleeping positions based on need or hierarchy. The very young, very old, or currently sick get the platform spots. Healthy adults sleep farther away, contributing their body heat to the collective, while enduring more cold themselves. It's a system that requires social cohesion and shared sacrifice, and it works. Scandinavian populations survive winters that would devastate southern Europeans. Travel south to Italy or southern France and winter is a different beast. Temperatures are milder, but buildings are designed for summer heat management rather than winter warmth. Mediterranean castles have thin walls compared to northern fortresses, more windows, better ventilation, all wonderful in August, all terrible in January. Southern nobles solve the cold problem partly through braziers, metal containers filled with charcoal that can be moved from room to room. Braziers don't provide the sustained heat of a proper hearth, but they're portable and don't require chimneys, which makes them versatile. The danger is carbon monoxide poisoning charcoal. Burning in enclosed spaces produces toxic gas that's killed countless people who sealed rooms too tightly, trying to stay warm. Southern Europe also has different bedding traditions. Fur is less common because local animals don't develop the heavy pelts that northern species grow. Instead, southern nobles use quilted covers filled with wool or cotton, layered in multiples to achieve insulation. These quilts are lighter than northern furs, which southerners prefer because their buildings aren't as cold and excessive weight is uncomfortable. Southern sleeping customs also include heated bricks wrapped in cloth and placed in beds before sleep ceramic or stone that's been heated in kitchen fires and transferred to bedchambers, a variation on the warming pan concept, but using solid material that holds heat longer. Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary. The Russian Principalities develops yet another approach. The Russian pesh or masonry stove is an engineering marvel, a massive brick or stone structure that runs on wood, but burns so efficiently and stores so much heat that one evening fire can keep a room warm for 24 hours. The pesh often includes sleeping platforms built into its structure, and during extreme cold, families literally sleep on the stove using the massive thermal mass as a heated bed. This is communal sleeping by necessity, entire families arranged around or on the peach, but it works so well that Russian peasants in properly built homes survive winters that regularly kill Western Europeans. Climate affects sleep schedules too. In the far north, winter brings extreme darkness, only a few hours of weak daylight in December, and this encourages sleeping patterns that align with darkness rather than fighting it. Northern populations sleep longer in winter, sometimes 10 or 12 hours, their bodies responding to light deprivation with extended rest periods. This is called seasonal adaptation, and while medieval people don't understand the biological mechanisms, they recognize the pattern and adjust their lives accordingly. Work happens during the brief daylight. Sleep dominates the long darkness. Southern regions don't face the same extreme darkness, so winter schedules remain closer to summer patterns. Mediterraneans still wake with dawn and sleep after sunset, but the day length doesn't change as dramatically, and the cultural rhythm stays relatively constant. This affects everything from meal timing to religious services to when business transactions occur. A Venetian merchant and a Norwegian trader meeting in winter operate on fundamentally different internal clocks shaped by their home latitudes. Alcohol consumption varies regionally too, both in type and quantity. Northern Europeans drink more in winter beer mead and increasingly distilled spirits, both for the calories and the sensation of warmth that alcohol provides. The sensation is deceptive. Alcohol actually lowers core body temperature by dilating blood vessels, but the immediate feeling of warmth and the social bonding that happens around shared drinks make it valuable, despite the physiological costs. Southern Europeans drink wine year-round, but winter drinking is less about thermal sensation and more about tradition and sociability. Clothing customs reflect regional differences as well. Your English winter wardrobe includes wool and some fur layered for versatility. Scandinavians wear sealskin and reindeer hide materials that provide superior wind resistance and waterproofing. Mediterranean nobles wear lighter wool, sometimes silk, for those who can afford imports, and they layer less because their buildings and climate don't require the same extremes of insulation. These aren't just fashion differences, they're survival technologies adapted to specific environmental conditions. Historians still debate how much regional contact existed, how much people knew about practices in other areas. Certainly noble families intermarried across regions, merchants travelled extensively, and soldiers on campaign experienced different climates and brought knowledge home. But the speed of innovation was slow, and traditions remained stubbornly local. A Norwegian probably thought English castles were unnecessarily cold and poorly designed. An Italian probably thought northern sleeping arrangements were barbaric and claustrophobic. Everyone assumed their own methods were correct and everyone else was doing it wrong. What's universal across all regions is the fundamental challenge humans trying to maintain: 98.6 degree body temperature in environments that want to cool them to ambient temperature, and ambient temperature in winter can easily kill. The solutions vary: ceramic stoves versus open hearths, communal sleeping versus private chambers, wine versus mead. But the underlying problem remains the same. Medieval Europe is a patchwork of regional adaptations to this problem, each area developing strategies that work for their specific circumstances, each generation inheriting knowledge paid for by the frozen corpses of ancestors who guessed wrong. You're English, so you sleep the English way in a private chamber with a hearth fire under furs attended by servants who maintain the fire. This seems normal to you, the obvious way to handle winter. But in Bergen, a Norwegian earl is sleeping on a platform above a stew with his entire household. In Rome, a cardinal is sleeping under quilts with a brazier nearby. In Moscow, a prince is sleeping on a petch. All of you are solving the same problem with different tools, and all of you will wake up tomorrow if you're lucky, having survived another night. Regional differences matter, but winter is universal, and so is the human need for warmth. The fire crackles, the wind tests your shutters, the night deepens. This is your winter in your place in your time. Morning in a medieval winter doesn't arrive gently. There's no gradual brightening, no soft transition from sleep to wakefulness. You wake, or more accurately, you're forced awake by the cumulative discomforts that have been building through the night and finally become impossible to ignore. Maybe it's the cold that's crept back into the bed as the warming pan's heat finally dissipated completely. Maybe it's your bladder insistent and undeniable. Maybe it's the sound of servants beginning their dawn routine's voices in distant corridors, signalling that the castle is stirring whether you're ready or not. Whatever the trigger, the moment of waking is rarely peaceful. You open your eyes to darkness. The bed curtains are still closed, creating your fabric cocoon, and beyond them the chamber is dim, the hearth fire has burned down to coals providing minimal light, and sunrise hasn't happened yet. In December or January, sunrise might not occur until 8 or 9 in the morning, meaning you're waking in what feels like the middle of the night, even though it's actually dawn approaching. Your fire tender is still there, still awake, hopefully still awake, and you hear him moving, adding wood to revive the fire, the sound of logs settling and sparks rising. The first assessment you make every single morning is, did I survive? It sounds dramatic, but it's genuine. You check your fingers and toes, wiggling them to ensure they're responsive, making sure nothing went numb during the night. You take inventory of how you feel. Is your throat scratchy, suggesting illness is starting? Do your joints ache more than usual? Is your breathing clear or congested? Medieval people understand that nighttime is when the body is most vulnerable, when illness can gain footholds, when cold can do its worst damage. Waking up feeling reasonably normal is a small victory worth noting. Next comes the decision: stay in bed or get up. The bed is still warmish, the furs are heavy and comforting, and there's no urgent reason to move immediately. But staying in bed means your chamber remains cold, servants won't fully attend to it until you're visibly awake, and eventually you'll need to face the day regardless. Some mornings you linger, especially if the previous day was exhausting, or if you're slightly unwell. Other mornings duty demands immediate attention, councils to attend petitions, to hear the endless administrative work of ruling a kingdom. When you finally commit to getting up, the process is methodical and unpleasant. You push back the bed curtains and immediately feel the temperature drop, cold air rushing in to replace the warm pocket you've maintained all night. The chamber is still dim, lit only by the revived hearth fire, and cold enough that your breath is visible. You swing your legs out from under the furs, and even through your wool stockings the platform feels cold. Standing up, you reach immediately for the chamber robe hanging on its stand, pulling it around your shoulders before the cold can fully penetrate your nightshirt. Your servants are ready. They've been waiting for signs of movement from your bed, and now they spring into action. One moves to fully open the window shutters, letting in whatever weak dawn light is available. This makes the chamber colder briefly as outside air enters, but light is necessary and the cold will moderate as the hearth fire builds. Another servant brings a basin of water for washing, though in winter this is a minimal affair. You'll wash your hands and face nothing more, because heating enough water for a full bath is an enormous undertaking reserved for special occasions. The water in the basin is warm heated in the kitchens and carried up while you are still waking. You plunge your hands in and the warmth is shocking and wonderful, your fingers tingling as blood flow returns to extremities that spent the night slightly cooled. Washing your face with warm water is one of winter's genuine luxuries, a moment of comfort in an otherwise harsh routine. The water has been scented with herbs, rosemary maybe, or lavender to provide a pleasant smell, and supposedly to have medicinal properties that protect against winter illness. Dressing is complex and layered. You don't dress yourself, that's what servants are for, but you participate holding out arms for sleeves, stepping into garments, standing still while things are fastened and adjusted. First, the daytime brays, then a linen undershirt, then wool hose that are tied to your brays with laces, then the tunic wool again, fitted but not tight, reaching to mid-thigh. Over that, potentially another layer, a surcoat or robe, depending on what the day's activities require. Every layer is armour against the cold, and you wear more layers in winter than summer, adjusting your outfit to seasonal demands. Your extremities receive special attention. Hands get washed, and then dried thoroughly, because damp skin in cold air leads to chapping and cracking. Some mornings you apply grease or oil to your hands, creating a barrier against moisture loss. Feet get checked. The wool stockings you slept in are replaced with fresh ones, and your servant examines your feet for any signs of problems, blisters or cracks, that could become serious if ignored. Shoes are leather-lined with more wool or fur, chosen for warmth rather than appearance since you'll be indoors mostly. Hair is another matter. You've been wearing a sleeping cap all night, and now it comes off revealing hair that's been pressed flat and probably looks terrible. A servant combs it. Medieval combs are bone or wood with wide-spaced teeth, and arranges it appropriately for daytime. Beards. If you wear one, get similar attention combed and possibly trimmed. Personal grooming in winter is complicated by the fact that everything is harder when you're cold and your fingers are stiff. Throughout this process, you're becoming aware of the castle waking around you. Servants are moving through corridors, voices echoing off stone walls. The kitchens have been active for hours already. Bread needs to be baked. Fires need to be burning for breakfast preparation, and kitchen work starts well before dawn. You can smell smoke from multiple hearths, now the scent drifting through the castle as dozens of fires burn in different rooms. You might also smell food cooking, bread baking, and your stomach reminds you that you haven't eaten since yesterday evening. The chamber pot from last night gets removed by a servant whose job is specifically this. He doesn't make eye contact, doesn't acknowledge what he's carrying, just efficiently removes it for emptying and cleaning. This happens every morning, unremarkable and essential, one of those tasks that nobody talks about, but that must be done or life becomes unbearable. Historians rarely mention chamber pot management in accounts of medieval life, but it's as important as any other aspect of household management. Your bed gets attended to as well, though not immediately. Servants will pull back the furs and blankets later, allowing them to air and dry. Medieval people understand that bedding accumulates moisture from breath and sweat, and that damp bedding is both uncomfortable and unhealthy. In summer, bedding might be taken outside to air in the sun. In winter, it's aired near hearths, or simply left exposed to chamber air for a few hours. The bed curtains stay closed during the day, keeping the sleeping space somewhat separate from the rest of the chamber. Finally, you're dressed and ready to face the day. The transformation from sleeping vulnerability to daytime competence is complete. You're the king again, no longer just a mammal trying not to freeze. Your servants bow and step back, their morning duties complete. The chamber is as warm as it's going to get, which is to say still cold but tolerable. Daylight is filtering through the window, weak winter sun that provides light without warmth. You survived another night. The day awaits with its councils, petitions, decisions and responsibilities. But first breakfast, because even kings need to eat, and winter demands calories. You move toward the door, ready to leave your chamber for the great hall, ready to begin another day of ruling a kingdom while winter prowls outside, patient and persistent, waiting for nightfall when the whole cycle begins again. There's a persistent myth about medieval people, a story told and retold, sometimes with nostalgia, sometimes with admiration, that they were simply tougher than modern humans, that they had adapted to the cold, that their bodies were hardened by constant exposure, that they didn't feel discomfort the way soft modern people do. This myth is comforting in its way, suggesting that our ancestors weren't actually suffering, that they lived in harmony with harsh conditions rather than in constant battle against them. But the historical record tells a different story, and it's important to separate romantic fantasy from the reality of medieval winter survival. The truth is straightforward: medieval people froze, they suffered, and they died from cold in numbers that would horrify modern societies. They didn't have magical resistance to hypothermia. Their bodies responded to cold exactly like yours would, with shivering, with vasoconstriction, in extremities, with the desperate physiological attempts to maintain core temperature that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed catastrophically. The human body hasn't evolved significantly in the last 1,000 years. A medieval peasant transported to the 21st century would find central heating just as wonderful as you would. A modern person transported to 1347 would suffer just as much as medieval people did, no more, but importantly no less. The historical evidence is overwhelming. Medical records from monastery infirmaries document constant winter ailments, frostbite requiring amputation of fingers and toes, respiratory infections that progressed to fatal pneumonia, hypothermia cases where victims were found dead in their beds or on roads. Chronicles mention harsh winters by name: the Great Frost of 1234, the Winter of Deep Snow in 1281, because these seasons killed so many people that they became memorable historical events. Parish death registers show clear spikes in mortality during winter months, with January and February particularly deadly. Frostbite was common enough that everyone knew someone who'd lost digits or limbs to cold damage. The progression is predictable: exposed skin in severe cold loses sensation, tissue freezes, gangrene sets in. If the damage is severe enough, an amputation becomes necessary to prevent death from infection. Medieval surgeons developed specific techniques for cold-related amputations, which tells you something about how frequently they performed them. A shepherd caught in a blizzard, a soldier on winter campaign, a beggar sleeping rough all faced significant risk of permanent injury from cold exposure. Children died. This is perhaps the most devastating counter to the "they were tougher" myth. Medieval infant mortality was catastrophically high, and winter cold was a significant contributing factor. Babies and toddlers can't tell you they're too cold, can't adjust their own blankets, can't move closer to fires. They depend entirely on adult vigilance, and even the most attentive care couldn't prevent all cold-related deaths. Parish records document babies found dead in their cradles after cold nights, children who developed respiratory infections that proved fatal, toddlers who wandered away from hearths and succumbed to hypothermia before being found. The elderly died too in numbers that medieval people came to expect and almost accept as natural. Old people regularly didn't survive winter, their deaths so common that phrases like "winter took him" became standard explanations. These weren't peaceful deaths in sleep, they were deaths from pneumonia, from heart failure brought on by cold stress, from falls on icy floors that led to injuries that wouldn't heal. Medieval wills often contained provisions that acknowledged this reality. If I survive until spring, or should God grant me another summer, historians have found evidence in skeletal remains too. Medieval skeletons show signs of nutritional stress that worsens in winter, of growth interruptions in children's bones that correspond to harsh seasons of degenerative joint conditions, worsened by cold and damp living conditions. These aren't the bones of people comfortably adapted to their environment. They're the bones of people whose bodies were damaged by the conditions they endured. The myth of medieval toughness often comes with claims about adaptation, about how constant cold exposure builds tolerance. There's a grain of truth here. Humans can acclimatize somewhat to cold, developing better circulation to extremities, more efficient shivering responses, but this adaptation is limited and takes weeks or months to develop. More importantly, adaptation doesn't eliminate danger. An acclimatized person might feel slightly less uncomfortable in cold conditions, but they're still at risk of hypothermia, still vulnerable to frostbite, still subject to the same physiological limits that govern all human bodies. What medieval people did have was better knowledge of behavioral adaptations, knowing to keep moving. If you're caught outside in cold, understanding which wild plants could be burned for heat. In emergencies, recognizing the early signs of hypothermia in companions. This knowledge was hard-won, purchased with the lives of people who didn't know these things and died as a result. But knowledge isn't the same as physical toughness, and knowing how to survive cold doesn't mean the cold is any less dangerous. The social acceptance of cold-related death is perhaps the most striking difference between medieval and modern attitudes. Modern societies treat preventable cold deaths as scandals. Homeless people freezing is considered a social failure. Deaths from inadequate heating spark outrage and reform movements. Medieval societies accepted winter deaths as inevitable, tragic, but not surprising part of the natural order that couldn't be prevented except through individual preparation and divine mercy. This acceptance doesn't mean people didn't grieve, they absolutely did, but it meant there was less societal pressure to solve the problem through technological or social innovation. Wealth made an enormous difference in survival, which also contradicts the toughness myth. If medieval people were all equally adapted to cold, wealth wouldn't matter so much. But it did. Rich people had better clothing, warmer chambers, more food, calories being essential for maintaining body temperature, and access to medical care when illness struck. Poor people had thin clothes, unheated hovels, inadequate food, and no medical care. No, the mortality rate differential was stark. Nobles sometimes lived into their 60s or 70s, while peasants dying in their 30s or 40s was common, and winter cold was a major factor in this disparity. There are accounts of people surviving remarkable cold exposure, a shepherd trapped in snow for days, who was found alive, a child who fell through ice and was revived, and these stories get repeated because they're dramatic and inspiring. But for every survival story, there were dozens or hundreds of deaths that went unrecorded, unnamed people who encountered cold and lost. Survival stories are memorable precisely because they're exceptional, not because they're typical. Medieval people themselves didn't claim to be tougher or more adapted. Their writings are full of complaints about cold, expressions of relief when spring arrived, prayers for mild winters. They understood perfectly well that they were vulnerable, and they took extensive precautions, all the layering the fires, the bedding we've discussed, not because they enjoyed the challenge, but because without these precautions they would die. The elaborate survival strategies aren't evidence of comfortable adaptation, they're evidence of desperate necessity. So when you're lying in your bed tonight under 6 layers of furs attended by a servant whose job is to keep you from freezing, what you're experiencing isn't some quaint historical curiosity or demonstration of medieval character. You're experiencing genuine danger managed through enormous effort and expense, with the knowledge that despite everything you're doing, people in your kingdom are dying tonight from cold. Some in their beds, some on roads, some in fields where they're sleeping because they have nowhere else to go. They're not dying because they're weak or inadequate. They're dying because humans are tropical animals trying to survive in climates that actively want to kill them. And sometimes, despite everything, the cold wins. The myth of toughness is comforting, but the reality is harsher. Medieval people were exactly as vulnerable as you would be in their place, and they knew it. That knowledge shaped everything about how they lived, how they built, how they slept, and how they measured the value of warmth. So why did they stay? Why did kings and nobles choose to live in stone fortresses that were brutally cold when other options existed? Why endure these frozen chambers, these dangerous nights, this constant battle against a building that seemed designed to kill you? The answer isn't simple comfort or ignorance. It's about power, about the fundamental equation that governed medieval rule. Where stone meant strength, height meant control, and suffering through winter was the price of maintaining dominion over land and people. Stone castles aren't primarily residences, they're military installations, political statements, symbols of permanent authority carved into the landscape. Your castle occupies the highest defensible position in the region, its walls visible for miles, announcing to everyone who sees it that this territory has a master who can command the resources to build in stone. Stone requires quarries, skilled masons, years of labour, enormous wealth. A wooden manor house can be built in months. A stone castle takes decades and represents generational commitment to holding this specific piece of ground. You sleep in a frozen chamber because that chamber sits atop walls that can withstand siege engines, that can shelter your household during invasion, that proclaim permanence and power in ways that comfort never could. Height is military necessity. Your bedchamber sits in the upper levels of the keep, the most defensible position in the castle, the last place enemies could reach if every other defense failed. This placement means you're far from ground-level heat sources like kitchens, exposed to wind from all directions, sleeping in what's essentially a stone tower that channels cold upward like a chimney in reverse. But this height also means that taking your castle requires enemies to fight their way through multiple defensive layers, climbing walls under arrow fire, breaching gates reinforced with iron. The cold chamber is the price of military security, and military security is what keeps you on your throne. Medieval political power is deeply tied to physical presence in fortified locations. Kings who can't hold castles lose kingdoms. It's that straightforward. History is full of examples. Nobles who preferred comfort and lost power to more determined rivals. Kings who retreated to warmer cities and saw their territorial control collapse. Your grandfather understood this, which is why he built the newer sections of this castle, despite having a perfectly comfortable manor house 10 miles away. The manor was warmer but couldn't withstand serious attack. The castle can hold against armies. So you sleep cold because sleeping cold in a defensible position is better than sleeping warm in a place you can't protect. There's also the theological dimension. Medieval Christianity has a complicated relationship with physical comfort, viewing it sometimes as legitimate blessing, but other times as potential source of sin. Suffering, especially suffering endured patiently for duty's sake, has spiritual value. Kings are supposed to be warriors, strong, capable of endurance, and sleeping in chambers that test your fortitude. Every single night proves something about character. It's not just about impressing others, though, that matters. It's about proving to yourself and to God that you're worthy of the position you hold. Soft men lose kingdoms. Hard men, men who can endure discomfort without complaint, men who wake up cold every morning and still fulfill their duties, these are men fit to rule. The stone itself carries meaning beyond pure military function. Stone lasts. Wood rots, thatch burns, earthworks erode. Stone buildings survive generations, becoming the physical embodiment of dynastic continuity. Your great-grandfather laid some of these foundation stones. Your grandchildren, if fortune permits, will rule from these same walls. The castle is inheritance made tangible, each stone, a promise that your family's claim to this land will outlast you. Sleeping in rooms that haven't changed substantially in 70 years connects you to ancestors, creates continuity grounds your authority and historical legitimacy. The cold is part of that continuity. Your father froze in this chamber, and his father before him, and enduring what they endured makes you worthy of the legacy they passed down. Control requires visibility and presence. Your castle overlooks the surrounding countryside, the town below the roads that connect this region to others. From your windows, when you're not shuttered against winter wind, you can see your domain, watch the people, whose labour supports your lifestyle, monitor the traffic that moves through your territory. This surveillance isn't abstract or symbolic, it's practical governance. You need to know what's happening in your lands, and elevation provides literal perspective. Sleeping somewhere warm but poorly positioned would mean losing this oversight, and lost oversight means losing control. There's also competition among nobles, a constant jockeying for status, where the size and strength of your castle signals your importance relative to other lords. You can't appear weak, can't seem less capable than rivals can't be seen choosing comfort over strength. When other nobles visit and see your impressive fortifications, your high towers, your thick walls, they're being sent a message about your power. If they also endure uncomfortable nights in your guest chambers, that's reinforcing the message you're strong enough to live in a fortress that lesser men would find intolerable. The cold becomes a form of dominance display like a peacock's tail, expensive, somewhat impractical, but effective at communicating fitness for leadership. Medieval people also have different baseline expectations for comfort. You've never experienced central heating, never slept in a climate-controlled room, never known anything except buildings that are hot in summer and cold in winter. Your reference point for acceptable living conditions is calibrated differently than a modern person's would be. This doesn't mean you don't suffer, you absolutely do, but it means you don't have the same sense that things could be radically different. Suffering is normal. Cold is expected. The question isn't why endure this, but rather, what are you willing to endure to maintain power? And the answer clearly is quite a lot. Innovation happens slowly, and changing residence patterns requires overcoming enormous inertia. Your castle represents decades of investment, complex administrative systems, defensive positions that have been refined over generations. Moving to a warmer but less defensible location would mean abandoning this investment, retraining guards who know every corner of the current fortifications, leaving a symbol of power that took lifetimes to create. The practical obstacles are immense, and medieval institutions change glacially because the costs of change so often outweigh the benefits, even when the benefits include basic comfort. There's also the simple fact that during much of the year, castles aren't terrible. Spring, summer, and fall in a stone building can be quite pleasant. The thermal mass that makes winter brutal makes summer bearable. The high ceilings that let heat escape in January provide relief in July. The ventilation that creates winter drafts prevents summer stuffiness. You endure 3 or 4 months of genuine cold in exchange for 8 or 9 months of acceptable or even pleasant conditions. It's a calculation that makes more sense when you consider the full annual cycle rather than focusing solely on the worst season. Ultimately, you stay because the alternatives are worse. A warmer building means military vulnerability. Abandoning stone fortifications means abandoning the physical foundation of your power. Choosing comfort over security is how kingdoms are lost, how dynasties end, how territory passes to rivals who are willing to endure what you're not. So you sleep in your frozen chamber under your 6 layers of furs attended by your vigilant servants, and you accept this as the cost of rule. Your ancestors made the same choice. Your descendants will make it too until something fundamental changes about military technology, or political organization, or building science. The fire in your hearth continues burning. Your servants maintain their vigil. Outside, winter continues its patient siege, testing your walls, your preparations, your endurance. You've survived another night, and tomorrow night you'll do it again, and the night after that, through all the winter months until spring finally arrives with its warmth and relief. This is what it means to be king in medieval Europe, not just ceremony and authority, but also cold chambers and wakeful nights, endurance and sacrifice, stone walls that protect and imprison simultaneously. The warmth you'll feel in April will be sweeter for having earned it through these frozen months. The security you maintain justifies the discomfort you endure. Power has a price, and that price is paid nightly in degrees of cold, in hours of careful survival, in the gap between the warmth you want and the warmth you're able to create. It's enough. It has to be enough. You close your eyes and wait for sleep. There's one more element of medieval winter sleep that we haven't fully explored, something that exists in the spaces between wakefulness and dreams, in the stories people tell themselves when darkness presses close, and the rational mind loosens its grip. This is the realm of folklore, of superstition, of the folk medicine and spiritual practices that shape how medieval people understand and cope with the vulnerability of nighttime. These aren't just quaint beliefs or primitive misunderstandings, they're psychological survival mechanisms, ways of maintaining hope and agency in situations where control is limited and danger is real. The bed itself accumulates superstitions. Before climbing in, many people make the sign of the cross a quick gesture that's part prayer, part protective magic. Some recite specific verses. Psalm 91 is popular with its promises of divine protection. He will cover you with his feathers, and under his wings you will find refuge. These aren't empty rituals performed by rote. When you're about to surrender consciousness in a cold chamber where people sometimes don't wake up calling on divine protection, feels both appropriate and necessary. Your own bedtime prayers aren't just theological obligation, they're psychological preparation, a way of releasing the day's anxieties and placing yourself in God's hands for the vulnerable hours ahead. Certain objects are believed to have protective or warming properties beyond their physical characteristics. Amber beads worn to bed supposedly ward off nightmares and winter illness. Stones with natural holes called hag stones or witch stones hung above beds are thought to prevent malevolent spirits from disturbing sleep. You personally don't put much stock in these folk beliefs, but you've noticed that servants often have such tokens tucked into bed frames or sewn into mattress covers, and you don't interfere. If believing in a stone's protective power helps someone sleep better in a frightening environment, who are you to dismiss that comfort? Garlic appears repeatedly in medieval winter folklore, and unlike some superstitions, this one has practical basis. Braids of garlic hung near beds or tucked under pillows supposedly prevent illness and ward off evil influences. Modern medicine would explain this differently. Garlic has genuine antimicrobial properties, but medieval people just know that households where garlic is abundant seem to experience less winter sickness. The mechanism doesn't matter as much as the observable correlation, and so garlic becomes part of the defensive arsenal against winter's dangers. Dreams during winter are different, more vivid, and often more disturbing than summer dreams. Medieval people attribute this to humoral imbalances, the cold producing excess phlegm that affects the brain, but there are practical explanations too. When you're sleeping under massive weight, somewhat oxygen deprived from closed bed curtains, and smoky air cycling through segmented sleep with periods of semi-consciousness, your brain produces stranger, more memorable dreams. You've had winter dreams that felt prophetic, or divinely sent visions that seem to carry meaning beyond random neural firing. Nightmares are taken seriously in medieval culture, not just as unpleasant experiences, but as potential spiritual attacks. The word mare itself comes from Germanic folklore, a malevolent entity that sits on sleeping people's chests, causing the sensation of paralysis and suffocation that modern medicine calls sleep paralysis, but medieval people understand as demonic assault. When you wake in the night, unable to move, feeling pressure on your chest, seeing shadows that seem to have form and intention, it's genuinely terrifying. Crosses on walls, prayers before sleep, religious medals under pillows, all these are defences against the mare. Fire has its own folklore, its own spiritual significance beyond mere heat production. The hearth fire is often seen as semi-sacred, a domesticated piece of the sun's power that connects your household to divine warmth and light. Some people won't let hearth fires die completely even in summer, maintaining at least embers that can be revived because a completely dead hearth is considered bad luck or even spiritually dangerous. Your fire tender, when he adds logs at night, sometimes murmurs prayers or traditional phrases: burn bright, burn true, keep the dark away from view. These aren't official church liturgy, they're folk practices that persist alongside Christian theology. Animals in bedchambers aren't just warming tools, they're also spiritual protectors. Dogs are believed to sense supernatural presences that humans can't detect, and a dog that suddenly becomes agitated in the night might be warning of dangers invisible to human senses. Your household dogs are welcome in chambers partly for warmth, but also because their presence is reassuring on multiple levels, their keen senses providing early warning of both natural and supernatural threats. The threshold of your chamber door holds significance too. Salt scattered across the threshold supposedly prevents evil from entering, salt being precious purifying, associated with preservation and protection. Some people mark doorways with crosses or holy water. Your door has been blessed by your chaplain at the beginning of winter, a ceremony where he sprinkled holy water and recited protective prayers while making the sign of the cross on the doorframe. This is standard practice in religious households, but it's also continuous with much older traditions about sacred boundaries. Morning rituals often include Thanksgiving prayers, acknowledgement that surviving the night wasn't automatic or guaranteed. You thank God for protection through the dark hours, for the fire that didn't fail, for the dawn that arrived on schedule. This isn't just pious formality, it's genuine gratitude born from awareness that others didn't wake this morning, that somewhere in your kingdom, beds are being found with cold occupants who won't see today. What's undeniable is that these practices serve a function. They give people agency in situations where agency is limited, provide structure and ritual that makes the frightening act of nightly surrender less terrifying. When everyone in the castle is making similar prayers using similar protective objects, telling similar stories about what guards them in the night, it creates collective comfort. You're not facing winter darkness alone, you're part of a tradition supported by practices that have sustained countless people through countless winters. Tonight you've prayed your prayers arranged, your protective objects performed your rituals. The fire burns with its semi-sacred light. The bed has been blessed, prepared, warmed. You've placed yourself in God's hands and also done everything practical that human knowledge suggests. This combination of divine trust and human preparation characterizes medieval approaches to danger. You pray, but you also act. Tomorrow, if God wills, you'll wake to face another day. The folk knowledge, the protective practices, the prayers and charms will remain ready to guard you through tomorrow night, and all the winter nights that follow. The night deepens around you now, and your breathing slows into the rhythm of first sleep. Beyond your bed curtains, the fire tender remains at his post, a silent guardian against the dark and cold. The logs settle with soft whispers, sending brief showers of sparks up the chimney, each one a tiny prayer of light and warmth. Outside your window, winter holds the land in its ancient grip. Frost etches patterns on village windows. Snow lies quiet over frozen fields. Somewhere in the darkness, other fires burn in other hearths, peasant cottages, with their smoking central fires, monasteries with their carefully tended braziers, manor houses scattered across the countryside, each one a small declaration against the cold, each fire tended by someone fighting the same battle. You are on a different scale, perhaps, but fundamentally the same humans using fire and shelter and community to survive until dawn. The stone walls around you will stand for centuries, long after you've gone after your children, and their children have lived out their own winters in these chambers. The walls will remain holding the memories of countless cold nights, countless wakeful hours, countless small victories of survival. Future generations will walk these corridors and perhaps wonder what it was like, how people lived, how they endured. They might imagine it was easier than it was, or harder, or simply different in ways they can't quite grasp. But tonight, right now, there's just this, the weight of the furs, the faint smell of wood smoke, the distant sound of wind testing the shutters, the warmth slowly building in your small fabric sanctuary. Your body relaxes into sleep, trusting the systems you've built, the servants you've employed, the knowledge accumulated over generations. Morning is hours away, spring is months distant, but dawn will come as it always has, as it always will, and you'll wake to face another day carrying forward the endless work of survival and rule bearing the cold as your ancestors did, as your descendants will. Sleep now, the fire burns, the watch continues, the night passes, and in the morning, when weak winter sun finally touches these ancient stones, you'll rise again, dress again, face again, the duties that justify your presence in this fortress. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight you've done what needed doing. You've prepared, endured, survived. That's all anyone can do. That's all anyone has ever done across all the winters that have come, and all the winters yet to arrive. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.